Hey guys, how are you all? Today we are back with another blazing Naruto story. What if Naruto could see every even hidden craving and fulfill it instantly? If you enjoy this video, then please like, share and do comment. And also check the description to original creator of this beautiful creation. So let us start the story.
A small boom FF blew in his ear as Katsuyu dispelled, leaving Naruto flat on his back and staring up at surprisingly calm blue sky. Staring further than he could comprehend into the fathomless forever. Thinking thoughts beyond his understanding. Trying to decipher feelings he could hardly even name. Chaotic emotions and exhaustion clouded his already strained sanity. Despite having just seen it with his own eyes, despite the paper bouquet of roses lying beside him, despite the pitifully comforting weight of Ero Sennin's novel on his chest, Naruto's mind struggled to grasp this new reality. Anyone else would have been elated over defeating Pain, his master's killers. But the victory left a bittersweet aftertaste in Naruto's mouth. After talking with the man behind the reanimated emotionless corpse, and hearing the easily relatable story of Yahiko, the monsters were so much more than faceless enemies now. They had names, hopes, goals, ideals. The fact that Nagato would never get to enjoy the clarity of his new outlook on shinobi life, or just the meaning of life itself, left Naruto feeling torn between regret and resignation. And heartbroken for Konan. The sad expression of acceptance that had been on her face reminded Naruto again of Hinata's bloody smile as she had challenged Pain. The unforgettable image once more summoned the panic that had burned in his gut at the resolute tone of her voice, the calm strength in her words, the solidity of her stance. His eyes had widened in horror as she ignored his pleas, accepting each vicious blow like it was her fate. Every grunt of pain that had escaped her shaking body twisted his soul with a desperate fury that had finally exploded into a demonic rampage. Despite Katsuyu's assurances before she had dispelled, Naruto squeezed his watering eyes closed, struggling to calm his twitching body and fall into sage mode so he could touch on her reassuring chakra. Relief washed over him anew as he sensed it, and he hoped that she was not just going to survive, but that she would be back to normal in no time. He needed to see her. He had so many questions. Like, why did she do that? Why did she say that? Why didn't she listen to him? Why did it have to be her? And, his intuition clung to her faint sensation like a moth following the dim glow of a candle flame. Why did her chakra feel so different than anyone else's? It was like diving into his bed after an exhausting day of training. Like the first bite of ramen after being away from home for years. Like the first deep breath of air after diving to the bottom of the river. He craved more of it. He wanted to turn it over and examine its alluring facets like a pretty stone in the palm of his hand. Struggling to his feet, Naruto stumbled his way back towards Konoha, but didn't make it very far before the burn of his muscles and the ache of his bones forced him to sit heavily upon a large rock. The paper bouquet and Ero Sennin's book tumbled from his arms as he slid down its stony face, letting his head fall backwards. Dappled shadows from the trees overhead danced across his sprawled legs as the sun sank lower on the horizon. Naruto smiled lopsidedly, remembering how he used to fall asleep in the shade after Ero Sennin whipped his ass in a brutal chakra training session, then let him lean against his sturdy back just like the stone behind him now. It was a peaceful spot. A beautiful bit of nature hidden in the forest. A remembering place. Letting the reprieve slowly build up his chakra from its rock-bottom post-battle level, Naruto slipped a kunai from his pouch and carefully chipped away at the rock. Just as the sunlight began to shift into the orange hues that signaled the oncoming sunset, he stood and brushed his hands together in satisfaction at the carefully carved kanji. Setting the book and the bouquet down upon the little shrine, Naruto turned to plod the rest of the way to Konoha, heavy of step but lighter of heart. Sleepiness was winning over physical exhaustion, and just as Naruto tripped for the umpteenth time, Kakashi appeared in front of him. "Sensei," he whispered hoarsely, tears immediately springing to Naruto's weary eyes. He had been clinging to the reassurance that Nagato's jutsu had worked even though the Akatsuki leader had been fading fast. While the brief post-battle moment in sage mode spent counting the chakra signatures of his precious people had helped stabilize his sanity, the living, breathing presence of the man standing before him was a much-needed reassurance that had Naruto sputtering happily through tears that he quickly tried to wipe away. They walked back in silence. Naruto clung to his sensei's back as he once more fell deep into thought. Fatigue had stolen his words, so instead of the normally ceaseless fountain of questions, the student merely laid his heavy head upon the strong shoulder offered. Kakashi was fuzzy on many details himself, so there was nothing to be gained by talking in circles, and Naruto could only wait in bleary anxiousness to see what actually remained of Konoha. Did everyone see his transformation? Did they all realize that he had essentially failed to save Konoha? If he had not been saved by his father at the last second, the world would be a much different place. Would they accept that it was the very enemy who destroyed the village that had then resurrected them all at the cost of his own life? Would they even believe him if he told them the truth? Shouts roused him from his deep reverie, and Naruto blinked his sleepy eyes as he realized they had reached what was left of the village gates. As he gaped at the massive crater, haggard shinobi and civilians began crawling over piles of debris to get a better look at the disheveled head of blonde hair. The further Kakashi walked into the ruined village, the more people began to gather and call out his name in recognition. Naruto's heart seized in trepidation at the sight of the growing mob, flashbacks of shouting and chasing through dusty alleys overlapping with the sounds of thudding footsteps. The crowd raced to greet them as he slid from Kakashi's back down onto the dirt of the road, making him shuffle backwards in instinctual defense at their charging progress. But Naruto blinked in confusion as he made out the words of excitement and found their faces were filled with triumph and joy, not hatred and disgust. Jumbled congratulations and groping hands blurred into an overwhelming mass of disheveled humanity that rang in his head. Naruto had always craved attention, but now his nerves were so frayed he couldn't rationally process yet another shock. He just wanted some peace, calm, or repose after the apocalypse they all had barely survived. The feeling of her soothing chakra flitted through his memory. Yes, that was what he needed right now. Scanning the crowd, Naruto searched for her face. The fear that she was alive but still seriously hurt was nearly choking him. Vaguely familiar faces swam before him, screaming his name in a way that grated his ears yet excited him. The whole thing was so confusing, he had so many questions, so much he needed to say, to process. He needed her. Just as Naruto was about to leap away to enter Sage Mode, a pink blur glomped him in a brutal embrace. Sakura ch. Naruto couldn't even gasp out her name when a split second later pain shot from his head down his spine. He clutched his head, grinding his teeth in pain as she immediately switched from one emotional extreme to the next. Her rarely bestowed physical affection rapidly returned to the usual physical affliction as Sakura reamed him for his recklessness. A snarl of frustration escaped his clenched jaw. Seriously? After everything that had just happened, that they had barely endured, she was gonna scold him? He wasn't exactly asking for accolades, or strutting back into the half-destroyed village like some kind of conquering hero. He just needed a little comfort. To see his precious people whole. Alive. After Conan had left, Katsuyu had answered his insistent questions about Hinata, telling him how Sakura had healed her. The thanks that he had been preparing to give Sakura for her help dried on Naruto's tongue when he couldn't get a single word out between her sniffled upbraiding. Her yelling caused the group of people to fall silent in shock at the sight of their savior being abused so zealously by the Hokage's respected apprentice. Naruto felt them pause but didn't care about the ebbing adulations, he just wanted to get away. As he was about to grab Sakura by the shoulders, she suddenly wrapped her arms around him once more, and her angry shouts turned into racking sobs. It was too much, Naruto couldn't keep up with her. His own feelings were a roller coaster ride that he could barely endure, and now Sakura's swinging fist and crushing hug were grating painfully on his already raw nerves. His own soul needed healing before he could begin to hear her out. The crowd around them completely missed his discomfort and growing panic. They AWWWED had what appeared to be a powerful reunion of teammates, and Naruto stiffened under the unwanted outsider's leering intrusion. It all felt so wrong, but Naruto patted her awkwardly, trying to paste a smile on his face while looking around desperately for someone to help him peel her off his body. As he glanced around the now cheering crowd again, noting that, of course, his sensei had disappeared already, he finally saw her. She was leaning heavily on Neji's shoulder, her face nearly white but a soft smile tilting the corners of her mouth. Her eyes glistened with tears that he could easily decipher without effort. She was sad, but happy at the same time. Naruto called her name, shoving away from Sakura and ignoring her yelp of indignation as she was immediately eaten by the rising crowd. Desperation tinged his voice as he yelled again, the fact that he had finally found her but couldn't get to her feeding his frantic pushing through the throng of humanity. Hinata must have heard him call her name because her pearly eyes widened just a fraction before he lost her once more in the press of hands that were roughly hoisting him into the air. He grimaced as they tossed him in jubilee, his brain rationalizing that this was supposed to be a good thing, even while his heart ached for an answer to the questions boiling in his soul. At least he had finally seen her. She was able to stand and smile, and Neji was by her side. Taking comfort in the short glimpse he had gotten of her face, Naruto tried to appreciate the current moment, the epic realization that the villagers apparently had finally come to respect him as a shinobi, as a human, and as a member of the Leaf. But between his forced grins and their jarring congratulations, Naruto couldn't help but wonder at the sincerity of it all. He had been the pariah for so long, it was hard for him to fully accept their adoration. After spending what felt like a lifetime talking with Nagato about what it meant to have a change of heart, this sudden flip of the switch from the mostly faceless civilians just did not register in his head. He needed more time to process all of this. Someone to listen to his side of this insane story and comb through the surreal until all that was left was the solid truth. But the someone he wanted had disappeared, and all that remained were strangers' smiles and the throbbing of Sakura's latest blow on his head. Catching glimpses of a few familiar faces in the morass of bodies, Naruto tried to signal to them for a little help. But they all just watched with glee as he was assaulted by well-wishers in the assumption that he must be loving all of this. For surely the deviant of the academy would revel in this attention. He always was happy, always bounced back. The most predictable thing about him was that he would be fine. One way or another. So they never paused to ask what had actually happened. What he had really been through. If he was honestly okay. Finally Naruto was able to free his hands from the grasping handshakes long enough to create a shadow clone and escape. Far away from the smothering people he was able to breathe freely once more. Wandering the demolished streets of the barely recognizable village, Naruto felt none of the pride or joy that he usually did after a battle. This didn't feel like a victory. Their adoration didn't feel fulfilling in the way he had thought it would. The respect felt forced. None of them understood exactly what had happened after he tore out of the village after pain. They had no idea exactly what the last few hours had changed in him. That he never could have done it without Hinata's words, without his father's help. He still needed help. Something in his heart pulled him towards her. Call it curiosity, longing, or just plain need. As the sun finally fell below the horizon on this endless day, Naruto crept through the sea of tents that were popping up across the destroyed village. Sage mode activated, seeking her presence. He found her in the most obvious place, the group of tents that now occupied the partially destroyed Hyuga compound. He wondered why she wasn't one of the Hyuga allowed to sleep inside the standing portion of the remaining dwellings. Wasn't she the daughter of the clan head? But it suited his purpose better that she was near the edge of the clump of tents, with no one save Neji nearby to watch over her rest and healing. Naruto stood tall as he walked up to Neji, not masking his steps, knowing that he was probably spotted a while ago. Neji didn't ask why he was there, if anything he seemed relieved that he had actually come. Giving Naruto a look that seemed to say, "Be careful," and, "I will kill you," in the same glance, Neji allowed him to pass. But his lips twitched in what Naruto wanted to think was amusement as he walked out of earshot. Entering the tent on tiptoe he hoped Hinata was not asleep yet, but was not willing to wake her if she was resting. The swish of the tent flap behind him elicited a soft sigh from the cot where she laid facing the canvas wall. Her voice was soft and tired as she turned her head back toward his direction. "Neji-Nisan, I promise you I'm fine." "Oh, Naruto-kun?" He swallowed thickly at the sight of her dark hair splayed out on the thin white sheet which was stamped with the hospital insignia. It must be one of the crappy blankets from the emergency supplies. Did they not even give her something warmer? It was chilly tonight, and surely the Hyuga had some resources. Why would she not deserve some extra comfort? The thought made him frown as he shuffled closer to her, wanting to see her face better in the darkness, needing to grasp her thoughts through her honest eyes. Needing her to see his own if words failed him. "Hinata, are you okay?" The stupid question was out before he could stop it, and Naruto nearly smacked his own face. Of course she wasn't okay. She took a beating from a demigod and was stabbed through the chest. No matter how amazing of a healer Sakura was, there was no way Hinata was okay. "I'm fine," she whispered, shifting slightly in an attempt to rise, but Naruto immediately reached out and gently pushed her shoulder back down upon the creaking cot. "Don't get up. I just came to talk, to see if you were okay. And, well, to thank you." Somehow, despite the blood loss, pink still tinged her cheeks at his touch, and he yanked his hands away before the warmth of her could completely register in his mind and wipe away the few coherent thoughts he had scraped together in his brain. Hinata tugged the pathetic blanket up to her chin, mumbling into its hem. "It was nothing. Bullshit." She startled at his harsh language and firm tone, blinking up at him with wide eyes. But this time Naruto didn't regret his words. Incredulity bubbled up inside him at the surprised way her mouth fell open. How could she not see it? How could she not know how amazing she was? Without having to think, his feelings tumbled out of his mouth. "You nearly died for me, Hinata. When everyone else gave up, when I gave up, you still fought. I told you to save yourself. I told you to run. I told you to forget about me. But you just kept attacking. Why? Why did you do that?" The urgent question hung in the air with the fog of his breath as Naruto knelt beside her, mesmerized by the vivid expressions flitting across her eyes as she gawked up at him. Her genuine emotions were laid bare for his easy understanding, containing none of the contradictions presented by those he had seen so far. There was no preening, no expectation, no anger in her gaze. No false front put on for the benefit of any who may see, nothing but her and him. His chest ached with relief? Joy? Anxiety? All those things and none were right. Naruto stared into her face, his sanity urgently needing her to answer him out loud, to validate the feelings that he thought, hoped, he was reading in her silver eyes. The earnestness of his gaze finally overwhelmed her, and Hinata began fidgeting under the blanket. Her eyes shifted around the tent, looking anywhere but directly at him. After what felt like an eternity, she whispered something into the crumpled fold of the scratchy sheet fisted in her hands. Naruto leaned in closer, his ears nearly twitching in the attempt to catch her soft voice. "Say it again," he breathed, his shameless disregard for her personal space making her swallow hard as her knuckles turned white where they fisted the blanket. "I said, because we never give up. It's our Nindo." Her trembling eyes finally lifted to his own, and Naruto blinked down at her in sudden recollection. A hazy memory of a short conversation on the training grounds before the Chunin exams flashed through his mind. A tiny and timid Kunoichi giving him the reassurance and courage to fight for his goals. A greater encouragement than Jiji or Kakashi Sensei, or anyone had given him at the time. It had been a gift of true belief. A feeling of faith he had greatly cherished in the moment, and it proved to be pivotal in his success. A small warmth that was not forgotten, even though it had been buried under mountains of much more painful emotions. "Yeah, it is, isn't it?" he murmured thoughtfully as he mulled over the fact that Hinata was making a habit out of showing up just when he needed it most. Something he was selfishly grateful for, although he hated how much she had suffered for it. Studying her face intensely, he was pleased with the reassuring flush of her cheeks and the healthy shine of her moonlight eyes. Naruto wished he could erase the sight of her body ragdolling through the air from his mind. The words she had spoken as blood ran down her face pounded in his chest faster than his racing heart. He would forever be in debt to this woman for what she had risked in order to save him. But can he forgive him? He needed more from her. Just a few more minutes before he let her rest. A little bit more clarity so he could sleep in peace as well. He needed to know once and for all. Looking down at her, Naruto steeled himself to ask the question that had been burning in his mind from the instant he had been restored to his senses by his father. A simple question, but loaded with so much emotional weight that it was going to crush him if he did not unload the burden. "Hinata," he asked in a husky and hesitant voice, "did you mean it? All those things you said to me?" A brief look of confusion passed over her face at his vague question, but he waited, sternly staring down at her and allowing her to read his own thoughts in his vibrant blue eyes. Suddenly the blush on her cheeks traveled all the way up to Hinata's ears, and her fingers began ruthlessly picking away at some poor thread in the sheet. Something like panic flitted over her expression, and Naruto nearly groaned in agony as anticipation twisted his stomach. He waited for her to deny it, to play it down, to take it back, to claim it was all a part of the rush of battle. To faint or turn away from him like she always did. He waited for her to explain it away, though he desperately wanted her to say it again. He wanted her to say it to his face, so he could see the truth in her eyes. He waited. The keen ache in his chest was churning with more and more intensity with every passing second, eating him alive. He needed this, needed the purity of her honesty more than he had ever needed anything in his entire life. His hands grasped the edges of the cot, nearly cracking the flimsy poles as he waited to hear the words that no one had spoken to him before, just one more time. At last Hinata raised her eyes to meet his own, and the lip she had been chewing on released as she inhaled sharply at the look on his face. Something seemed to settle within her reticent expression, and in an instant a small trembling smile curved her mouth. The sheet rustled softly as her hand swiftly slid out from under the blanket and pressed against his whiskered cheek. "I meant all of it, Naruto-kun," she fervently whispered, but her voice rang inside his head like bells of celebration. His rough hand reached up and pressed her palm into his face, the affection in her touch an intoxicating shift from a lifetime of harsh blows. In a final, incredibly irrevocable reassurance that nearly shattered his heart, she said those blessed words again. "You have done so much for me. I am not scared to die protecting you, because I love you." The flap of the tent snapped open before Naruto could respond, and both of their heads whipped around at the heavy atmosphere which pervaded the small space as Hyuga Hiyashi stepped inside. Hinata's hand yanked away from his face so quickly her nails scraped across his cheek. The loss of her touch instantly annoyed Naruto, and the aura of negativity that burst the warmth of their little bubble put his frayed nerves on edge. Hiyashi stared down at them with inscrutable silver eyes that seemed to read all the words which the two had spoken as though they were still dancing in the air between their huddled bodies. Naruto swallowed hard, turning to stand and face the intimidating clan head. The stiff sheet rustled behind him as Hinata shrank from her father, unable to even utter a proper greeting. Sweat prickled between Naruto's shoulder blades as the thickening silence started suffocating him under its mounting anxiety. Before he could begin to formulate a way to possibly explain his presence with the Hyuga heiress, alone, at night, in her tent, Hiyashi's clipped voice split the cooling air. "You may leave, now." Naruto didn't budge, every fiber in his body rebelled against the very idea of leaving her side. His mind had not stopped reeling from all that had happened, all that he still wanted to say. He wanted to stay by her side all night, and tomorrow, and forever? The thought of the loneliness that would be awaiting his return to his most likely destroyed apartment was much less appealing than even the dirt floor by Hinata's side. The hard lines of Hiyashi's face deepened with every second of Naruto's hesitance to obey. "That wasn't a request. Leave or I will have you removed. There are things I need to discuss with my daughter." Glancing down over his shoulder at the thin sheet that was nearly vibrating where Hinata clutched it in her white-knuckled grip, Naruto's hand fisted as well. The severe reputation of the Hyuga was no secret in Konoha, and the absolute last thing he could endure after a day like today was the idea of anyone so much as breathing harshly near her. His filter was dangerously thin, his patience nearly gone, and his usually overflowing forgiveness was damn near dry. "Hinata saved my life today," he blurted out, meeting Hiyashi's narrowed eyes with a sharp lift of his chin. The man's brows raised infinitesimally at his abrupt statement and loud voice. "She was the only one who came to help me fight pain. And even when she was injured she did not stop attacking." Naruto proudly squared his shoulders with his declaration, assuming that no father would overlook such bold praise of their daughter. He was wrong. Did she defeat him? Naruto blinked, the simple question and flatly unimpressed expression on Hiyashi's face completely throwing him off balance. The truth stuck to the roof of his mouth as Naruto licked his lips, choosing his words carefully. "She nearly died to give me the chance to fight. So the enemy prevailed until you stepped in? Then she failed." Hiyashi's nostrils flared. Had he been a less dignified man he would have snorted. "I am not surprised." Heat tinged Naruto's ears as his temper flared. It was the Akatsuki. And Pain was their leader, the most powerful one of them all. "Even I could not defeat him until. All the more reason that she is a fool for having ever challenged him in the first place," Hiyashi snapped, his own patience expiring by the second. "A fight for a Jinchuriki, not a kunoichi who is unable to defeat even her younger sister." "Hiyashi-sama," Neji cut in, having slipped into the tent when he heard Naruto's raised voice. He planted himself between the two, discreetly trying to nudge Naruto towards the tent opening as he calmly addressed his uncle. "It is because of Naruto that the leaf is still standing. He just came by to thank Hinata-sama for her support before he left. Naruto clicked his teeth at the roundabout dismissal. Something in him sickened at the idea of taking credit for something that he felt he did not do, that he could never have come close to achieving without Hinata's help, without the Kyuubi's chakra, without his father's help, without Nagato's help. The sense of being an imposter soured his mood further, and he was just about to dart out of the tent in self-disgust when Hiyoshi's next statement froze him in his tracks. "There is no leaf," the clan head's voice ground out between his clenched teeth. All three teenagers stared, pinned by the undercurrent of steel in his measured syllables. "The village is destroyed," Hiyoshi continued darkly. "The market is gone. The Hokage Tower is gone. The police headquarters are gone. The academy is gone. The Hyuga compound is practically obliterated. Our scrolls are ashes. Our antiques, our weapons, the very traditions of our clan are gone. And you, the greatest weapon in Konoha, who should be protecting our home, dares to come and celebrate your victory with this foolish girl?" Naruto balked at the vocalization of his inner guilt, taking a step back and feeling his calves bump into Hinata's cot. As his heart shrank under the insinuated accusation of his failure, doubt burrowed under the fragile hope that had started to grow from the sudden downpour of praise he had endured earlier. Deep down, he had worried the sudden admiration of the villagers was too good to be true. Their acceptance, their respect, it was only a matter of time until they all forgot about today. Until he messed up again. His spiraling thoughts stuttered as her warm hand enveloped his shaking fist, and Naruto reminded himself of why he was still standing here. This moment wasn't about him defending his actions, it was about defending her. After everything she had done today, the least he could do is save her from something. "Hinata is anything but a fool," Naruto hissed, opening his hand and clasping her fingers tightly. "I would know, I have been called a fool my whole life. I've been called a failure. A demon. A weapon." He looked down, studying the warring fear and admiration in her eyes as she processed his words, and what little self-preservation he had left flew away into the night. Lifting his face to steadily meet Hiyoshi's deep frown, Naruto gallantly delivered his own heartfelt truth. "Hinata is more of a hero than I ever was, and I am proud to call her one of my precious people. You're the one who should be ashamed of ever doubting your daughter." Hinata's gasp and Neji's grunt of disbelief echoed in the deathly silence of the empty tent. Naruto's heart pounded in his ears. He knew he had crossed a line. Knew he would be paying dearly for blurting out a fact that was a long time coming. But he had run out of fucks today. If he went down for defending Hinata's honor, even if it had to be to her own father, then he would at least greet defeat with a greater sense of pride than he had felt when the villagers were chanting his name. Hiyoshi was staring at their clasped hands, his mouth working as though even his stoic Hyuga demeanor could barely contain his wrath. "Precious person?" His eyes darkened as the clan head stepped closer, looming intimidatingly over the blonde teenager as he struggled to maintain a brave expression on his whiskered face. "She is a Hyuga, a disappointment as an heiress, but a part of the clan until the day she dies. Do you have any idea what that means, demon?" Naruto opened his mouth but Hiyoshi had no intention of letting him speak. "It means obedience." He leaned into the word as he leaned closer, the veins on his temples pulsing with emphasis. "It means she is nothing to you. A Hyuga is a Hyuga. A demon is a demon. Her purpose is to serve the clan in whatever way I deem fit. Yours is to defend Konohagakure. You both are failures, and I would sooner brand her as a servant in her own clan before I ever let her anywhere near you again." "You can't do that," Naruto exploded, panic causing him to completely forget the potential cost of his instant retaliation. For the first time in his life he was close to experiencing something he had always longed for but never felt. If nothing else good ever happened to him again, he would be satisfied with just this inexplicable warmth which blossomed within his chest when Hinata was near. She said she believed in him. She said she had faith in him. She said she loved him. Even if it was only ever just her, she was more than enough. He could never give her up. "I can and I will," Hiyoshi growled. "Because first and foremost I serve my clan. I am the one who must protect them. Who must ensure that they all obey our laws and remain loyal generation after generation. And I will not cower like a child when tasked to do what is necessary, no matter the cost." Naruto's voice grew in volume even as the Hyugas lowered threateningly. "Forced obedience under threat of punishment is not loyalty," he shouted. Do not belittle our traditions. Hiyashi roared, finally reaching his own breaking point. How dare you stand there and pass judgment on something you could never understand? How dare you look down on the sacrifice of our people? If not for Hyuga like Neji's father, who have obediently given their lives to protect our dojutsu, Konoha would never have survived as long as it has. We are a long chain of proud shinobi, who have stepped up over and over again to do our part, to obey our fate. I will not allow one weak link to break the Hyuga's legacy of strength. Go near each other again, and I will not hesitate to mark her with the caged bird seal and ensure her obedience for the rest of her life. No, the word had been on the tip of Naruto's tongue, but somehow Hinata had beaten him to it. His surprise was such that he nearly fell over as Hinata used his arm to gingerly pull herself up to standing. His eyebrows shot up as Naruto gaped down at her ashen face. It was scrunched up with the effort of her posture, her teeth biting into her lip to hold in her grunt of pain and hide any signs of weakness from her father. Love is not a cage. Obedience is not a fate. Neji's sharp inhalation and the crack of Hiyashi's knuckles as his hand tightened into a fist made Naruto's gut twist with a fear far greater than his own sense of self-preservation. The seething chakra that had been building and simmering within Hiyashi began to throb heavily around his deep-set eyes. My worth as a kunoichi, as an heiress, is not just based on who I can defeat, Hinata timidly whispered, then she took a deep breath and painfully straightened to her full height. I am more than a Hyuga. Naruto-kun is more than a Jinchuriki. Naruto reached out and grasped her shoulder, steadying her, supporting her. He didn't think he'd ever heard of Hinata standing up to her father before. Hinata is really strong, he thought with awe, staring at her in open admiration. Perhaps after taking on a god, now Hiyashi doesn't seem so scary. He is a hero, my precious person. And I will not abandon him, Hinata stuttered softly, but with an edge of steel in her voice that even had Neji's eyes widening in shock. Hinata, let him go. Hiyashi bit off each word as it slowly passed his tight lips. The bulging veins of the clan head's Byakugan focused on his daughter, and for the second time that day, Naruto was truly terrified. His head snapped up, every instinct flaring to high alert at the hatred which laced the Hyuga's voice. He knew that tone, knew that icy look. He had seen it a million times before on 100 other faces over the years. His hand trembled on Hinata's shoulder, his tired nerves betraying his unease as he braced for anything. This is your last warning, daughter. Do not shame me any further. Forget about that boy. Naruto could feel his breaths becoming ragged, his teeth sharpening. A maelstrom of apprehension and anger was swirling inside him. He was afraid she would leave, afraid of what would happen if she didn't, afraid that he wouldn't be able to hold back much longer. Hinata's second hand came up to firmly press into his arm as she gulped, but quickly rearranged her expression into a look of determination that Naruto was rapidly becoming enamored with as she lifted her chin to meet her father's glare. Never. Then you've made your choice, Hiyashi murmured with a burst of chakra from his dojutsu. His hands began flashing through signs, and Neji was instantly moving, his keen eyes recognizing each damning hand seal as Hiyashi's fingers danced through the air. But out of all the jutsu Hiyashi could have used to punish Hinata, this one Neji couldn't stop. This one he was powerless to counter. The chakra that tipped his fingers spluttered as his knees buckled. The caged bird seal on his own brow resonated with a splitting pain that raised traumatizing memories of the day he was branded, and his heart sank as he saw Hiyashi slam his hands together in the final seal. Hinata had frozen, her body shaking as she saw fate swinging the doors of her cursed cage shut. Tears rolled down her cheeks, but her face was a mask of solemn acceptance. For once, she commanded her heart, I will not shrink from him, I will not cower, I will not recant. A part of her had always known this day would eventually come. That she would finally fail hard enough for him to brand her, casting her into the same cage that contained the rest of the demoted branch family. Apparently showing another human being true love was the worst thing she could have done. The thing that had finally tipped the scales. So be it, she thought with calm resolution as she braced for her final moments in Naruto's presence. He was worth it. Naruto's fury was instantaneous, unleashing the chakra he had been holding in check and letting it flow through his network in a rush that spiked his hair. The red, bubbling, demonic aura seeped out of his pores, flowing across his skin like a wildfire out of control. The Kyuubi's chakra had always been a slave to instinct. intervening when the stakes were highest, stoking his anger, spiking his adrenaline, healing him on the brink of death. And in this moment, it was protecting what was his. With her bold words now engraved upon Naruto's heart, Hinata was forever a precious person, a treasure to be guarded jealously. For the entity who had had everything taken away, from his family to his freedom, this opportunity to tell fate to go fuck itself was enough to rouse the ire of a demon. Naruto barely registered the surge of chakra that flowed across his body and enveloped Hinata as well, just as she reached up to press her hand to her head. Her stifled scream was drowned by his feral snarling as he pushed her behind him and faced the real monster channeling the brutal jutsu. In the back of his blurry mind, Naruto vaguely heard an internal growl echo in unison with his own gritty voice as he and the Biju aimed their combined threat at Hiashi's straining face. "I will never let you cage her." The electrifying power of the Kyuubi no Yoko flashed across Hinata's network, burning away the faint traces of the ugly seal that had just started to appear on her forehead. A sharp gasp made Naruto turn his red-slitted eyes back to her round face just as he was starting to be pulled under by the Nine-Tails' hatred, and he gaped at what he didn't see. Long strands of dark hair danced with the intensity of the red chakra cloak, revealing Hinata's unmarked forehead and shocked expression. "Demon!" The rage-filled shout yanked Naruto's attention away from her flushed face, baring his sharpened incisors at Hiashi's pulsing Byakugan. The Hyuga leader recoiled slightly, never having experienced the full brunt of a Biju's feral hatred before. The pure demonic energy was enough to make his soul shudder. But the clan head was determined to wield his righteous judgment upon the wild Jinchuriki and the unfaithful spawn who cowered behind him. The penetrating glare of his Byakugan focused upon the tenketsu of Naruto's abdomen, which throbbed like a beacon beneath the seal. Naruto saw the flicker of Hiashi's gaze and all the muscles in his body coiled as he spun around and grabbed Hinata. The tent was blown away by their skyward leap, the jabbing tips of Hiashi's chakra-charged fingertips just brushing the loose folds of Naruto's orange jacket as he barely escaped the deadly gentle fist. Landing atop a leaning portion of the compound wall, Naruto practically roared into the night. Hiashi's ferocious attack only served to stoke the building rage which was rapidly eroding Naruto's sanity once more. The fragile firewall his father erected earlier was crumbling quickly under this mounting fury while he was still in an exhausted state. But before the horrifying blackness could fully engulf Naruto's mind, her chakra was pouring through his network like cooling water over boiling magma. "Naruto-kun, stay with me," Hinata pleaded, clinging to his boiling body with the same desperation with which he struggled to hold the remnants of his mind. Her own meager stores of chakra glimmered just enough in his dimming awareness to snap him out of the damning downward spiral which blotted out his humanity. Naruto fought frantically to try and organize his mind, to separate it into two halves of not self and self, one floundering in pure hatred and one soaring with something unexplainable, but so alluring that he redoubled his efforts to follow its call. To follow the sound of her voice. Follow his heart. Before Naruto's eyes could calm back to blue, the listing wall beneath his feet exploded with an echoing crack as Hiashi's open palm strike splintered the wood to smithereens. Suddenly they were free falling. First Hinata's moonlight eyes, midnight hair, and then the stars above blurred into a confusing sight that Naruto's jumbled mind struggled to form into a plan before they were within the Hyuga's lethal range. His body wasn't going to hold up much longer. The corners of his vision were narrowing with the effort to hold her close as they spun weightlessly. They were going to crash. She was going to get hurt. He cannot let her get hurt. He cannot let her go. Just like years ago, when panic had overwhelmed his scrawny little body after Ero Sennin had pushed him over the cliff and sent him hurtling into a black abyss, Naruto's hands flew through the muscle memory of his greatest jutsu. His thumb was easily nicked on the sharp edge of his fang, and his voice reverberated with the same volume of his first true summoning. Kachiyose no Jutsu. They landed upon Gamakichi's back with a loud oof, and immediately the amphibian was leaping into the air, neatly dodging Hiashi's next attack. The couple were tossed skyward, neither of them being coherent enough to bind themselves to the toad's back with chakra. "Kichi, get us out of here!" Naruto screamed, as his arms tightened around a screaming Hinata. Pulling her securely against his body, he squeezed his eyes shut as a warm, wet tongue enveloped them both. With a loud gulp and a massive poof of smoke, The two shinobi and the toad vanished. The soothing melodies of the crickets hidden in the humid jungle of Mount Myoboku were abruptly silenced as one of their top toad predators exploded back into his home. In a wet gush, Naruto and Hinata were forcefully expectorated upon a thick patch of lush grass, then immediately abandoned by Gamakichi as he leapt away to soak his demon chakra scalded tongue in the river. They tumbled in a messy tangle of arms, legs, and saliva, with Hinata landing heavily on top of Naruto's chest. Slowly his eyes cracked open as he glanced around the silent night. Fogginess from his brush with demonic insanity after the brief fight with Hiashi was still clouding his mind, and the last few moments blurred into the unnaturally phosphorescent colors of the jungle with the surreality of a disorienting nightmare. Gradually the crickets picked up their songs again as the two laid still save for their breathing, and Naruto struggled to relearn what was dream and what was fact. Blearily he clung to the warmth of Hinata's solid, anchoring weight. Inhaling deeply, harshly, expanding his chest until his lungs trembled with the delicious tingle of free air. He hadn't failed. She was safe. He still had her. Scrunching up his face in discomfort as awareness of all his bodily aches returned with the lucency of his mind, Naruto looked down at the pile of dark stringy hair plastered across his orange and black jacket. Blinking quickly to clear his vision, he counted Hinata's even breaths and let his head fall back on the thick grass in relief, gulping painfully and panting greedily. The sensations of the thick humidity, sticky dampness, and her thudding heart were reassuring mental and physical footholds for his psyche, solidifying the fact that this moment wasn't going to fade away before he could memorize it. Sucking in a deep breath, Naruto held it, waiting until the pounding in his own ears matched the calmer pace of Hinata's heartbeats. When his chest began to burn, he exhaled his imprisoned breath through shaking lips, pursing them tightly even as his brow crinkled. With the return of coherence, a spike of fear was drilling up between his ribs. His questionable talent for being the most unpredictable shinobi had somehow managed to turn a day of potential glory into the newest shitstorm in his pile of problems. So much for being the hero. That had lasted all of a couple hours before he'd royally fucked that up. Now what? Ba-chan was gonna kill him. Every Hyuga was gonna be looking for them. Could he hide Hinata from them forever? Could he really protect her? He had to figure something out. The blob of midnight hair stuck to his chest moved, and Hinata whimpered as she roused, rolling her forehead across his chest as small hands fumbled to push herself upright. Naruto gripped her tighter on instinct, not wanting to release the comfort of her nearness. But another soft whimper caused him to instantly flinch away, fearing that the quick squeeze would worsen her pain. Guilt clenched his heart as his hands flitted helplessly over her upper body, not knowing where he should grip her, but needing to touch her in some way. Needing to offer some kind of pathetic comfort to soothe his own mind. Her body stilled as her hands planted upon his warm torso instead of cold dirt. With a sudden jerk of her neck, Naruto found himself staring straight into the gleaming wide eyes and reddening face of a very stunned Hinata. A soft warm breeze blew across their faces as they stared at one another. So close each felt the tickle of the other's random strands of drying hair brush against their flushed skin. Both were frozen by their own confusing mix of emotions while trying to read those swirling in the mirroring set of eyes. Hinata, are you okay? Naruto's words were somewhat slurred, his voice rough from strain. Hinata's mouth popped open, but no sounds escaped as her trembling gaze finally ripped away from his and darted around the wildly unfamiliar area. A large firefly floated past and she twisted a bit too far as she traced its flight with raised brows. Grunting weakly, Hinata pressed her hand to the barely healed wound on her ribs, biting her lips as her head fell again onto Naruto's bone. Shit, of course you're not okay. Naruto cursed himself as he lurched upwards, carefully cradling her in his trembling arms. Every muscle in his body burned with fatigue, but his concern for her well-being overrode every ache. The depth of his self-loathing was fathoms beyond his self-preservation as he clumsily tried to wipe the sticky strands of her thick hair away while she sniffled softly. I'm so sorry, Hinata, he whispered hoarsely with each stroke. I'm sorry I pissed off your dad. I'm sorry I dragged you away from your home. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Naruto rambled out his warbling apologies over and over with the fervor of a sinner begging forgiveness for their transgressions. His eyes scoured her from head to toe seeking any and every reassurance of health, but all he could see were her wounds. When her hand gingerly shifted to reveal the fresh blood that had seeped through her jacket, his self-worth fell to hell. "I'm so sorry," he choked, his hand darting up to clasp hers and press firmly onto the accusing red stain, making her inhale sharply. "I'm sorry I couldn't protect you. I'm sorry you nearly died. I'm sorry I ruined everything." A rueful inner voice berated him for his stupidity as he curled over her body in a belatedly useless desire to shield her from all the pain that he had already caused. "I never should have gone looking for her. I already nearly got her killed once. I should have just left her alone. This is all my fault. If only he had stayed away. If only he had ignored her confession. If he had just pretended it was nothing more than a loyal act of friendship, he could have spared her from her father's wrath. If he had walked away, she would still be with her family. If he hadn't been so selfish in needing to hear her say it again. This was all his fault. He really was dense. Any idiot would have learned by now that nothing good became of people who loved demons. Just look at all the people whom he had dared to care about during his life. His parents, Uruka-sensei, Sasuke, Sakura, Ero Sennin, Kakashi-sensei, Nagato, the whole damn village, her. What had happened whenever they stood up for him? They suffered. Triggered by his despair, a miserable string of memories reeled through his slowly shattering mind. The face of his father, smiling sadly with posthumous pride as he tried to assure his son that he was worth the ultimate sacrifice. The massive shuriken impaling Uruka-sensei's back while Mizuki-sensei revealed the truth for the first time. The hundreds of senbon stabbing all over Sasuke's body before he collapsed on that bridge. The fear in Sakura's eyes after he had mindlessly slashed her arm with his biju tail. The emptiness of seeking Kakashi's chakra signature earlier today and finding nothing. The absolute devastation of seeing his home reduced to a crater. The sound of the rod stabbing through her body, killing his sanity as nearly as it had killed her existence. The slump of Nagato's head as he gave up everything he had worked his whole life to accomplish, for the sake of Naruto's dream. They all had been driven to the extreme by being close to him. Driven to their mental breaking point. Their physical limit, even death. To know a Jinchuriki was to know the tipping point of endurance. To either run away or face death for their sake. For the first time in his life, Naruto felt sick as he recalled the consequences his acquaintance had reaped upon his precious people, and how far short his meager affection fell in recompense. The downward spiral of his thoughts expanded along with the blooming edges of the bloodstain on Hinata's shirt. Red liquid continually seeped slowly between his trembling fingers no matter how desperately he tried to staunch its spread. His teeth ground and his jaw clenched. His eyes clamped shut against the agony of the sight, his own soul bleeding out along with every fat red drop that fell from their fingertips. If this was love, he didn't want it. He wasn't worth it, and she deserved so much more. It would be better for him to disappear. Better if he had walked away when he had the chance and let everyone believe that he had died while fighting pain. He could protect them better by ceasing to exist. No matter how much they all celebrated his return, the fact remained that the Akatsuki still existed. No one would ever be safe as long as he walked the streets of Konoha. Hiyashi was right. It was only a matter of time until that organization came looking for him again. And this time there would be no hope of a resurrection afterwards. No way to erase his mistakes. Panic-fueled adrenaline accelerated his heart rate, his thoughts tripping over one another as he mentally spun out. I can't endure this anymore. This is all my fault. I have to run away. I can't hurt her again. Chilled fingers gently brushed away hot tears Naruto hadn't even realized were falling down his face. He flinched backwards, scared blue eyes snapping open to see her tired silver gaze scrutinizing his expression. A crease appeared between her brows, her lips thinning into a line, and ever so slightly she shook her head at him. Scolding him without uttering a word. The stormy resolution to never go near her again faltered in its destructive course through his mind as her hand tenderly traced his whisker marks one by one. Each simple contact was a mercy, a blessing, a pardon, a promise. He melted with every stroke, her patient affection knitting his shredded soul back together, stitch by stitch. Sniffling loudly, Naruto suddenly gripped her hand with a possessive strength, smothering the wail that nearly escaped his mouth into her open palm as his shoulders heaved with stifled sobs. His chakra flared, a knee-jerk reaction to the conflict between his returning resolve and his fear. The urge to save her from anything and everything, even himself, made his feral protectiveness surge in an oxymoronic wave that he immediately had to stamp down before it bubbled out of him in a red demonic miasma. But slamming a lid on his Biju chakra caused pain to reverberate through his overwrought network like banging a hammer on his head during a migraine. A small gust of power escaped his fragile self-control to ripple over the grass with a rough whoosh. To his dismay, Hinata grimaced, pulling her hand away and pressing her face into his shoulder as she curled up into his torso. "Hinata," he bellowed at point-blank range. "Did I hurt you?" She shook her head minutely, her nose brushing against his shoulder with each turn. After a few seconds that nearly suffocated him, Hinata slowly peeled her hand away from her jacket. Ignoring any ideas of modesty, Naruto earnestly inspected the dark stain, exhaling the breath he had been holding when it did not continue to darken with fresh blood. I think you actually stopped the bleeding," she whispered as she assessed herself. Relief helped to wash some of his irrationality away, and with a slightly clearer mind Naruto glanced around, trying to gain his bearings and estimate how far they might be from Pa and Ma Toad. He needed to get her to someone who knew more about healing than himself. He could worry about his own doomed salvation after he assured her survival. It took 2 tries to achieve Sage Mode, his focus as scattered as leaves in an autumn wind. But the large chakra signatures of the 2 strong toads were easy enough to pinpoint, and with renewed determination Naruto gently shifted Hinata against his chest and braced his legs to stand. Murmuring words that he hoped sounded consoling even though they rasped hoarsely from his dry lips, Naruto glanced down at Hinata's face to try and gauge her discomfort before he moved, and blinked in surprise. The bangs covering her forehead had shifted in the gust of his chakra, revealing the faintest pink traces of the incomplete caged bird seal. Unable to resist, he gently reached up to sweep his fingers across the unsealed skin of her brow. Her sharp inhale made him hesitate briefly, but instead of the grimace he expected, Hinata's cheeks flushed a darker shade of pink than he would have thought possible for someone who had lost so much blood. As though it had a mind of its own, Naruto's hand carefully traced each faded mark as he marveled at the way her features relaxed under his touch. A long breath slipped between her lips, sliding over his damp clothes and causing goosebumps to follow in its wake. He watched, mesmerized, as her delicate pink tongue licked her full lips. Once, twice, until she had finally lubricated them enough to form words. "Thank you for saving me again, Naruto-kun," she murmured shyly. His eyebrows shot up into his matted bangs. "Saved you? Hinata, I ruined everything. Hiashi was going to seal you because of me." It was coming, she cut him off, the words sharp even through her soft tone. "I've been trying to gain his approval my whole life. A losing battle, one that I don't intend to fight anymore." The long blades of grass hissed in the breeze as Naruto digested the depth of emotions that could be behind such a definitive statement. He could sympathize with the innate urge to fight for attention of any kind, good or bad, just to feel something other than the sting of invisibility. He knew too well the bitterness of thinking you had finally come close to finding a real connection, only to be betrayed at your most vulnerable moment. The torture of chasing that hope of reciprocation, though it seemed forever out of reach. As their eyes met, he could feel the honesty of the truth she was sharing with him, and he eagerly accepted its burden with a feeling of gratefulness at her show of trust. In the back of his mind he wondered, perhaps, if he had just been chasing the wrong person this whole time. Firmly gripping her shoulders and legs the way one would hold a precious treasure that was won at great cost, Naruto carefully stood, studying Hinata's face for any signs of pain. His own aching body and encroaching exhaustion fed his sense of urgency to get them both to a safe place where they could rest. Setting off at a riskily brisk pace, he unsteadily began to push his way through the thick jungle. All the stupid plants looked the same, and more than once Naruto had to pause and attempt Sage Mode in order to reorient himself until they reached a somewhat familiar-looking clearing which bore the scars of his secret Rasen Shuriken practice. Scratchy ferns swished around his knees as he waded across the meadow, snagging on his pants as he carefully scanned the ground for the trail he remembered. With each step the sparks of light from the variety of glowing insects native to Mount Myoboku burst out of his path, mirroring the jolts of pain in his muscles. After wading through the flora long enough to doubt himself, the faint moonlight finally revealed the vague shadow of the trail, winding up the hill on the other side of the clearing. A small groan slipped out of his flared nostrils before he shook himself and marched onwards. Hinata immediately began to apologize, trying to squirm her way out of his arms. But even the minimal twisting made her mouth tighten in pain. "Don't move," Naruto said sternly, but his hold on her was laced with as much tenderness as strength. "Let me carry you, I want to." Hinata looked down in chagrin, but obediently reclasped her hands around his neck in an attempt to brace herself better. The curtains of her drying hair hid her face as she hung her head, silently clinging to him. As they slowly progressed over the meadow and back into a thick forest of alien plants, he could feel her fingers twisting and clenching with strain, tugging on the hair at the nape of his neck. Just as he was about to stop and recheck her wound, Hinata sighed morosely. "My father is right, I am not strong," she rasped bleakly. "I am an embarrassment." Naruto nearly shook the girl in his arms in indignation. How could she say that after everything that had happened? After everything she had done for him? "Liar," he bit out between clenched teeth, causing her drooping head to lift. Wary pearl eyes studied the solemn set of his mouth. Her dubious expression flickered in and out of the moonlight that peeked through the massive overhead leaves. "But I lost," she persisted in her habitually harsh self-scrutiny. "I didn't stop pain, you did. I did not save myself from the cage-bird seal, you did." A tear slipped out and trailed down her cheek, her voice dropping to nothing more than a feathery whisper. "Even back then, I did not stand up to Neji Nisan and help him change, you did. I did not fight back against my father for years, but you did it the first time he challenged you. I'm a failure." Naruto snorted, twisting around a low-hanging leaf as they rounded a bend in the trail. "A proud failure," he corrected. Hinata's face snapped up in surprise as he hurriedly added, "And I never could have done any of those things without your words to get me going." Hinata's despondent expression gave way to frank wonder as he used her own words against her. A wry grin softened his stern glower as a saying Ero Sennin had told him once flitted through his memory and out of his mouth. "A firecracker is loud and flashy, but it would never explode without a steady flame to light its fuse." He glanced down at her to be met with trembling eyes that put the ethereal moonlight to shame, her lips parted in genuine wonder. Naruto's stomach erupted with butterflies, the sight capturing his focus with such magnetism that he completely forgot to watch his step. His foot caught on a large plant root and he stumbled shamefully for someone who claimed to be a shinobi, nearly causing them to crash as hard as his train of thought. Barely recovering before he hurt either her or his pride, Naruto cleared his throat harshly as he stomped onward, trying to stamp down the fluttering of his gut in the same way. "In all honesty, I'm the one who is a liar," he plunged on, awkwardly covering his slip-up with a stream of distracted rambling until he could think clearly again. "How many times did I scream that I would never give up because it was my Nindo? That I was gonna be Hokage and get a date with Sakura-chan?" The air in Hinata's lungs deflated, but Naruto was so anxious and confused by his own undisciplined emotions that he did not catch the underlying meaning behind her wilting posture. Ducking under a low-hanging leaf stem, he patted her absently in the misunderstanding that the tension in her hands was a result of his nearly dropping her and not the impact of his words. "And now look at me," he scoffed in self-deprecation as he gently tucked her more securely into his chest to compensate for letting her slip. "First I gave up in front of all of Konoha, until you came and pushed me. Then I let the village I swore to protect get demolished. And as for Sakura," an annoyed look flitted across his features and he snorted harshly. "Well, I guess the lump on my head speaks for itself." Sympathy for Naruto warred with self-pity in Hinata's heart at the mention of his teammate's name. She was well aware that Sakura had been the apple of his eye for years, so of course she assumed he still must harbor some feelings for the pretty Kunoichi. Just one day couldn't erase something like that in an instant. Hinata expected nothing more, nothing less. But as she studied the way Naruto's mouth twisted downward, and the brief flash of his eyes, confusion began to undermine her assumptions. The note of awe that usually sang in his voice when he said his teammate's name was distinctly missing. Did he drop her honorific intentionally or out of delirium? The small hints chipped away at Hinata's previous acceptance of where his affections might lie, fanning the carefully guarded dream that she had always harbored deep inside. Moment by moment she dug backwards through the blur of her memories for an answer to her question, for any clue to the true intentions of Naruto's heart. She contemplated the moment when he had knelt next to her cot, when the genuine emotions that had glimmered in his blue eyes were unforgettably tender. Then there was the way he had clung to her hand with the need of an addict seeking his fix, and cried unashamedly as he held her close. Hope mixed with curiosity, causing Hinata's heart rate to accelerate as she fought the selfish urge to fidget simply to feel Naruto squeeze her tightly again. While she had been lost in her own roller coaster of thoughts, the jungle path Naruto seemed to be following into nowhere narrowed. He barely stifled a yawn as he turned sideways to slide them through a tight gap between two enormous stems. But his growing fatigue and the poor light skewed his judgment, and in a split second the pair were stuck. Hinata gasped, suddenly finding herself pressed so tightly against Naruto she could hardly inhale. The sturdy plant was digging into her back, pushing her cheek against his shoulder and her forehead flush against the warmth of his throat. The pain would have been worse were it not for the way his arms were protecting her like a cage, pushing back against the stem in an attempt to prevent her discomfort. "Shit, I'm sorry, Hinata. Damn trail is hard to see," he grumbled, straining to adjust his hands and keep the plant from aggravating her injury while trying to free them as well. But instead of helping the situation, the shuffling only left him blatantly palming her rear. The more he fumbled, the more his mind started to cloud over in embarrassment as sweat trickled down his temple. Swallowing thickly, Naruto fought back a shiver as Hinata squirmed enough to lift her head, causing her breath to fan across the sensitive skin of his neck. Desperate to free himself from this entirely different shade of panic, the dense shinobi was unaware of how transparently his actions were telegraphing his inner turmoil to the studious eyes of the woman in his arms. "Naruto-kun," she said hesitantly, staring at the bounding pulse in his neck with far too much consideration to ease his rising blood pressure. Are you okay?" His hands twitched. He distinctly did not feel okay. He felt tired but buzzed. He ached yet was also floating. His mind was foggy but his nerves were on fire. This whole day had been an epic series of highs and lows, and it was all building up within him to the point where he thought one more squeeze of her curves against him, one more brush of her bangs on his neck, one more soft whimper from her mouth might be enough to finally break him beyond repair. "Fine, I'm fine," he bit out, shimmying his shoulders with a tinge of urgency. Hinata's breaths were coming quick and shallow, which was only making him more delirious. Planting a foot on the base of one stem, he gave an experimental push, slamming his head back into the opposing trunk with a heavy clunk that yielded no gain for his pain. "Crap, I really got us stuck, didn't I?" He chuckled sheepishly as Hinata tried to be of assistance by twisting her torso around to be flush with his own, freeing herself from his vice-like grip in the process. Naruto groped for a different hold, grumbling at her to stop moving before she started bleeding again and just let him fix his mistake. The futility of their combined efforts proved to be extremely blush-inducing when the twin plants simply snapped closer together, trapping the two shinobi nose to nose and chest to chest, with Naruto now cradling her ass with both hands as her feet dangled uselessly in the air. Near-death experiences could not compare to the raging turmoil in Naruto's gut as he stared straight into Hinata's eyes. The softness of her body smashed against his own shut down his brain, and all he could feel was a wonderful tightness in his chest that had nothing to do with the narrow gap of space they occupied. He might have simply gazed at her forever, caught in the riptide of her nearness, pondering the mystery of her perfect features and wondering why they were so hypnotizing. But the fuzzy moment snapped back into sharp reality when she spoke his name. "Naruto-kun, maybe if you let me go we can fit through?" Hinata practically squeaked. The corners of his mouth turned down and he didn't respond immediately, as though the suggestion was extremely distasteful despite its perfect rationality. But with another bashful nod, Naruto loosened his grip and set her free. The sensation of her body sliding under his hands as she slid inch by inch down the front of his body set his skin on fire. Neither one could tear their eyes away from the other, each striving to read the deeper emotions that words could not express. Gingerly her feet touched the earth, and a pang of regret replaced the warmth of her on his chest as she stumbled out of the gap. Hinata wobbled on weak knees, dizziness that may or may not have been from blood loss making her head swim. Naruto's arm was instantly gripping her shoulders protectively, apologizing over and over as his free hand pressed against her wound to check for more bleeding. Falsely confident words faltered on the tip of her tongue as the world spun so distractedly that all she could do was squeeze her eyes shut. His hand rubbed up and down her back as he waited anxiously while she took as many deep breaths as she dared. Finally feeling as though she could manage to not pass out, Hinata pasted a brave smile on her face and lifted her head to assure Naruto she was fine. But as she looked up, a rush of affection stole her words when she saw the deep flush of his face, the concern in his eyes, and the way he licked his lips over and over like he was fumbling for something to say for the first time in his life. The hope that had sparked earlier fanned into a flame that left her clutching at the front of his jacket for balance. Before either dumbstruck teenager could attempt any kind of greater comprehension of their situation, a gravelly voice yelped in shock from the next hilltop. "Naruto?" The pair whipped around as fast as their exhausted bodies could react at the unspeakably welcome sight of Ma Toad racing down towards them. "What on earth are you doing here? And who is this?" "Ma," Naruto sighed, one of his legs almost buckling as relief washed his confused brain. "Hinata needs your help." Massive dewdrops rained down upon Naruto's hair with each strike of his kunai as it sank deeper into the thick stem of the enormous plant. The dew had only survived this long into the late morning heat by hiding in the crevices of the lower leaves, and Naruto gladly let it cool his flushed skin as the sun climbed closer to its zenith in the pure blue sky. Its moisture mingled with the sweat already running down his face, collecting in the valleys of his tired muscles and running down his bare torso. The burn in his arms was a welcome discomfort, unlike the aching exhaustion from yesterday, which had disappeared with a few hours' sleep and his accelerated healing. This time it came from the sweat of productivity, not distress, and the satisfaction of his progress boosted his turbulent mood. The events of the last 24 hours were a tangled emotional monstrosity which loomed over his psyche like a second Biju, eliciting equal parts terror, anger, and a fierce sense of connectedness that was almost incomprehensible. All through the wee hours of the night unsolvable questions had plagued his subconscious, tossing him from one nightmare to the next. While awakening from those anxious dreams had brought a measure of relief, it was quickly blighted by an onslaught of equally complex feelings as Naruto had become increasingly aware of his surroundings. Namely, the enigma of a girl who had slept peacefully by his side, unaware of how he struggled to keep her literally and emotionally at arm's length despite the deep protectiveness that bled throughout his being. Last night he had awakened with a jolt to find himself practically curled around Hinata, having instinctively placed himself on guard between her and the door while selfishly drawing comfort from her warmth. He'd been so close that strands of her hair tickled his nose with each huff of his strangled breaths. Despite the adrenaline that had immediately begun to sear through his body, Naruto had been completely frozen while staring at her peaceful face. Sleep had a way of making the worried tilt of Hinata's eyebrows relax into two delicate arches that mirrored the full curves of her dark lashes. Whatever had been the object of her dreams, it was something pleasant enough to flush her cheeks a healthy pink. At times the corners of her lips had twitched delicately, as though hiding her inner secrets with a subdued smile. The sight of her nocturnal serenity had eased some of the tension in his chest, and he had deliberately tried to slow his breaths to match her deep, even sighs. His fingers had itched to peek under her soft blanket and check if the bandages around her ribs were stained red, but he hated to risk disturbing her much-needed rest. Instead, her easy exhalations that danced across his cheeks sufficed to give him reassurance of her well-being. He really hoped she would be okay. He wanted it so much that it scared him. In Naruto's mind it felt like all his life he had been forced to fight tooth and nail for each bond he made. Having to prove his worth over and over again. And now, the connection Hinata had forged with him in only a matter of seconds, in the middle of a life-and-death battle, with zero expectations or stipulations or hesitation, had suddenly taken root so deeply in his heart that it nearly choked him. Naruto had broken out of the toad's warm little home gulping lungfuls of the thick jungle air. The enormity of the gift she had offered him was overwhelming, and the magnificent mess he had made of her perfectly laid out life was a travesty of a response. Bolting across the awakening tropical forest, Naruto had raced through the tepid morning in search of anything to help him clear his mind, or even better, his conscience. As he had leapt from one towering plant leaf to the next as fast as his legs could go, applying Kakashi-sensei's tried and true method of brutally training away one's mental anguish until you couldn't move let alone worry, Naruto had stumbled across a forgotten structure. He had been retracing the uphill path of a tumbling river when the frame of an unfinished building had materialized out of the low blanket of fog in a clearing. A buried memory had surfaced. Pa Toad showing him the unfinished cabin arrow Sennin had started to build in anticipation of one day bringing Naruto to Mount Myoboku. During the arduous days of his sage training, Fukasaku had suggested that Naruto should finish the humble abode and sleep there instead of on the cramped floor of the tiny hut. But at the time the idea of being alone, in a place that was steeped in the shadows of his late master's specter, had been more than Naruto could endure. So instead of obeying Fukasaku's suggestion to pause his brutal training for a short time each day and mourn his godfather by completing the man's dream, Naruto had thrown himself into frantically perfecting his Rasen Shuriken as he had anxiously anticipated his return to the village. Oh, how much had changed in just a few days. Now Konoha was not in much better shape than the damp shack, and the thought of returning there filled Naruto with anxiety of a completely different tone. He and Hinata's futures were full of uncertainty and it weighed upon his mind, a heavy responsibility he felt compelled to address. Would they ever be able to return to Konoha? Naruto refused to consider returning without her, but the idea of going anywhere else was daunting. As it stood, they were both essentially homeless. Foreigners in a land that was, thankfully, very welcoming, but not natural for them at all. Naruto and Hinata were two humans caught in the in-between, between the past and the future. Certainty and mystery, clan and classless, friendship and, what? With a frustrated grunt Naruto struck the stiff stem again and again, viciously driving the kunai into the tough trunk with the force of his aggravation as well as his senjutsu. Pushing his limits physically and mentally as he attempted to maintain his sage mode longer than ever before. The time limitation of his natural energy was partially to blame for this shitty debacle. If he had only been able to hold it longer he might not have needed her to step in. Would not have needed the Kyuubi's damning chakra. By the time the orange pigmentation around his eyes faded from his face, Naruto was able to heave a sigh of satisfaction as the victim of his pent-up emotions toppled to the ground with a splintering crash that resonated out into the valley. With each tree-like plant that he had felled, his relentless pursuit of penitence via self-enforced labor was slightly sated, and his sage mode lengthened by a few more precious seconds. Brushing aside the bangs plastered to his brow, Naruto rolled his shoulders before raising his hands to create another shadow clone. No instructions were needed anymore. The routine that had started shortly after dawn ensured the Kage Bunshin knew exactly what he was supposed to do. Obediently taking up a meditative position on top of one of the fresh stumps created by the day's activities, the clone focused his entire consciousness on falling into the balance of nature. Nodding in satisfaction, Naruto picked up his kunai, flipping it in the air as he climbed on top of the felled plant stem and walked along its length to where lush leaves the size of shop canopies sprouted from its trunk. Birds, small little leaf frogs, and the occasional butterfly watched in fascination as the unfamiliar creature strode up to the largest leaf, gripping his weapon securely in two hands. Swinging it high overhead he brought it down with a grunt, severing the leaf clean off in a single hack. Naruto methodically worked his way down the trunk, cleaving off one leaf after another, the kunai glinting in the light with each mighty swing. The work was repetitive, thoughtless, and tiring enough to keep his anxiety in check, allowing his mind to chip away at its litany of problems, albeit with less progress than the branch-like leaf stems were removed. If only he could peel back the layers of his feelings for Hinata the way he peeled off the fragile leaves at the peak of the plant. If only he could chop off the confusing bits of their history to leave nothing but the naked facts of their present relationship the way he sliced away the uneven knots in the trunk, leaving a straight and sturdy support that was undeniable, dependable, and enduring. If only it was that simple. When all the leaves had been completely stripped away, leaving just a long green log-like stem, Naruto dispelled the meditating clone and immediately felt the rush of peace and power that came with the perfect balance of nature and chakra. Pocketing the kunai, he bent over and hoisted the heavy plant onto his shoulder with the ease of plucking a flower from loose soil, despite it being so thick he could barely wrap both arms around its width, and squinted one eye shut as bits of dirt skittered over his clammy skin and into his hair. Navigating the small group of stumps, he carefully picked his way through the thick forest and over the sloping ground down to the banks of the river that flowed from the top of the hill. Wind shushed through the canopy overhead, twisting through the lush greenery and making shadows dance on the earth where he stepped. Each footstep sank into the thick carpet of dead leaves and rotting mushrooms that coated the rainforest-like terrain as Naruto paced his breaths with his strides, taking extra caution to send chakra to his feet as he leapt across a few mossy wet boulders before reaching the water's edge. The sparkling water was a relieving sight, and he had arrived not a moment too soon. The senjutsu again faded away just as Naruto tossed down his burden on the edge of the river's pebbly banks. He was definitely getting better. This was the first time he had made the entire walk with just one clone's worth of sage mode. Shaking out his arms, Naruto inhaled deeply, flaring his nostrils, permeating every nook and cranny of his tired lungs with fresh oxygen, before forcing it out through tightly pursed lips. Twisting a bit to scan the shoreline, Naruto spotted the bundled-up t-shirt left by another cage bunchin he had sent foraging earlier. Squatting down, he untied the knot and plucked one of the fresh mushrooms from the pile, popping it into his mouth before hastily closing it back up. He hoped that the fungi would be a more delectable addition to the dinner of larvae and other insects that Ma Toad would most likely be preparing. Hinata was not used to the unique cuisine of Mount Myoboku, and Naruto already felt bad enough about her current predicament without adding indigestion to her list of misfortunes. Placing the makeshift satchel on his head and ensuring that it was well secured with chakra, Naruto grabbed a long stick, taller than himself, from where he had left it stabbed between the river rocks, and gave the massive plant stem a powerful kick into the river. It bumped over the sloping shore and splashed into the viridescent water as he sprinted after it, jumping on as it tumbled into the deeper water. His arms windmilled in the air as his feet skipped forwards and backwards on the spinning log as it rolled in the water, working to stabilize his makeshift transport while keeping his balance as it bobbed in the current. Eventually getting it to a steady glide, Naruto used his stick to work the plant downriver. His brow furrowed in concentration as he dodged rocks and other partially submerged obstacles along the way. The minutes ticked by as he choppily floated down the waterway, bouncing over the turbulent surface of numerous eddies, kicking off a boulder in the bend, and ducking under numerous low-hanging leaves and branches. Once in a while a fish would dart by, ducking for cover from the large being which had invaded their normally undisturbed corner of the toad's realm. The current calmed as the river reached the flatter meadows of the lower valley, and Naruto sat down carefully on his floating log, his straddling legs trailing alongside and leaving rows of spreading ripples. Pinning the long stick under his armpit and letting it drag behind in the water, Naruto leaned cautiously to the side and scooped up a handful of the refreshing coolness and splashed it over his face and neck. The liquid turned salty as it ran into his scrunched eyes, washing away the crystallizing sweat from his forehead, and he momentarily lifted the t-shirt bundle of mushrooms to shake his head like a wet dog. With yet another deep sigh, he tried to shift into a more comfortable position for the last leg of the short journey. Naruto wished he had more to show for all his sighing and thinking. Thinking and sighing, but only a few certainties had blossomed out of the hours he had spent strenuously working on the hillside. He was certain he was an idiot. He was certain he was in huge trouble. He was certain he was rapidly falling for Hinata in a way that terrified and excited him. And he was certain that it would only be a matter of time before he fucked that up as well. What he was not certain about was Hinata's expectations. Did she want to go back? Was she having second thoughts about him? He hadn't exactly been the most thoughtful friend. Did that mean he would be lousy at everything beyond that? What if he disappointed her even more than he already had? A dragonfly zoomed past his head, making him nearly lose his bundle of mushrooms, and Naruto snorted at his own continual distraction. Wondering was getting him nowhere, but the idea of going back to face Hinata without anything to show for his hours of absence motivated him to work even harder. The least he could offer her was a comfortable place to stay during their exile. Coming to the final bend in the river before it tumbled a bit further downhill then sharply plummeted in a graceful waterfall into the lower valley, Naruto carefully stood on the plant stem and whistled loudly. From the other side of a large sunlit meadow that opened up from the rocky riverbank, 2 of the 10 clones he had left working on splitting the previous logs into planks paused and trotted down to meet him. Between the 3 shinobi they managed to roll the fresh stem out of the water and up to the amateur construction site, letting it thump loudly into the others that he had felled and floated downriver since that morning. One cage bunchin tossed him a bamboo canteen of collected dew and Naruto guzzled it gratefully as he surveyed the progress of Ero Sennin's hut. It was almost square in shape, framed in a way that made it almost as tall as it was wide. The planks were nearly complete, and one clone was carefully using his kunai to plane the edges of each one to fit together as snuggly as possible when secured vertically around the wall. A pile of stones for the potential Iori were accumulating nearby. Off to the far side near the edge of the jungle, another clone was gleefully using one Rasengan after another to dig a latrine. That chore should definitely not be that much fun, Naruto thought with a grimace. Turning away with a sheepish shake of his head at the eccentricity of his own personality being put on full display, his gaze landed on the front door, complete and waiting to be installed. Walking over to the tall plant it leaned against, he ran his hand over the wood-like panels, appreciating the fact that his cage bunshin had taken care to smooth it over as much as possible. His fingers slowly traced the 4 kanji boldly carved right at eye level on the front. Uzumaki. It reminded him of the names that proudly adorned the entrance of many clan compounds. A mark of belonging, of a family. Naruto swallowed hard, his stomach twisting at the idea of bringing Hinata to this place and asking her to live here with him, under his name, under his roof, under his protection. The thought made heat flush over his skin with greater intensity than the midday sun as he imagined her possible reactions. Anxiety and hope created a variety of scenarios that ranged from fainting dead away in horror to a joyful embrace that made him feel like he could fly from here to Konoha. Quite the progress you have made here. Pa Toad's voice rang out from the edge of the trail that opened up from the forest, causing Naruto to nearly jump out of his skin as his daydreams burst in surprise. The Toad Sage was slowly picking his way across the meadow with his cane, stooping like an old man in a way which belied his potential power. But knowing that at this time yesterday Fukasaku had been drawing his last breaths, Naruto's heart clenched in concern for the old amphibian. How did you escape the hut? Ma Toad would have a fit if she found out you've walked all the way up here so soon after an injury like that. Naruto scolded the sage, who merely rolled his buggy eyes in dismissal. How many times do I have to repeat myself? Fukasaku grumbled as he waved a webbed hand through the air. I'm fine. Good as new, thanks to you, Naruto-chan. Naruto looked away, letting his arm fall limply from the door to his side as he shuffled his feet and shrugged, still not comfortable with what felt like undeserved praise. Fukasaku frowned at the lack of jovial boasting which would normally have been bursting from the boy who celebrated any small advancement in his training with an optimism that glowed as brightly as his hair. He studied Naruto's stormy eyes as the teenager meandered over and sat heavily on a felled log with the air of a man burdened by years of worry. The truth was Fukasaku was the one who was worried. The arrival of the 2 emotional wrecks at his hut last night was a yet-to-be-explained surprise. The girl was one of the quietest humans he had ever met, and not exactly spilling many details. Granted, she was quite injured and had spent most of the day dozing, but even Ma's friendly cajoling had barely elicited more than a few blushes and mumbled thanks for their hospitality. He considered himself a patient toad, but when Naruto-chan had failed to come back after missing breakfast and lunch, something had told him that it wasn't just because the shinobi was avoiding Shima's food. Tottering to his side, Fukasaku hopped up onto a nearby leaf as his newest protege leaned back against the plant's thick stem, and fixed him with a tolerably stern look. In a tone of voice that would brook no argument, he evenly demanded that Naruto meet his eyes. Okay boy, it is obvious that something is wrong, so spill it. And don't skimp on any details. The clones continued to make efficient work on the hut as the student and master sat together in the shade on the opposite side of the clearing, facing the progressively complete little home as Naruto described all the specifics of his battle with pain and what had happened after returning to Konoha. The sun trekked across the sky, casting the building and landscape into sharper relief as bit by bit the story unraveled. The clouds were starting to glow orange and pink along the horizon by the time Naruto sighed deeply and completed his convoluted tale. I see, Fukasaku murmured solemnly, folding his hands into his brown cloak. The wind blew through his tuft of white hair as his mouth worked in thought. He glanced sideways at Naruto, the teenager's shoulders hunched in a manner completely foreign to his personality, and the toad's sympathy stirred. The boy had been thrown into the harsher ranks of the world so early, nearly skipping the innocence of childhood altogether in his struggle to survive. His adolescence was supposed to be a time of self-discovery and connection, but instead he was burdened with the fate of an entire people. Despite all those obstacles, the things Naruto had accomplished, with his sanity mostly intact, was impressive as hell as far as Fukasaku was concerned. And now, out of nowhere, a precious and unexpected gift had appeared, completely turning his world upside down as she strode out into the center of Pain's destruction. Her words promising a potential joy unlike the poor guy had ever known. And yet instead of greedily devouring her offered affections, he denied his starving heart because all he could see were his own shortcomings and failures. It would not do. You did well, Naruto, the wizened amphibian smiled gently as his companion's head snapped up in surprise. Are you as senile as the great Grab Sage? Naruto barked in frustration. All I did was exactly what needed to be done, Fukasaku stated firmly, fixing Naruto with a sharp eye. It is impossible to extract perfect solutions from imperfect situations. The village is gone, but the will of fire still survives. You lost control of the Kyuubi, but met your father because of it. The Akatsuki still exists, but Nagato found the peace he had been searching for in the end. Hinata may have defected from her clan, but instead she chose you. A terrible choice really, Naruto grumbled, planting his elbows on his knees and rubbing his hands roughly over his face until his eyelids nearly turned inside out. I'm just one person. I can't replace a whole family. I don't know how to fulfill that kind of importance. I don't know how to reciprocate what she deserves. I don't know how to. His voice trailed off in a whisper as his hand raked viciously through his hair until his head thumped back against the plant stem in exasperation. I don't know how to love someone, he whispered. Fukasaku barely held back his snort. The kid must be some kind of stupid. From the first day that the old toad had laid eyes upon the orange ball of energy in the Godime's office and witnessed the plethora of emotions that had rocked his world when he learned of Jiraiya's death, he had known that this human understood things differently. He felt things differently. The depth of his passion, the fervor of his determination, the heights of his ambitions were all a reflection of the powerful love he held in his soul. Love for his home, love for his comrades, love for life. Perhaps this was one of those moments Ma was always telling him about, when Pa would forget how short and ignorant some of these humans' existences were, and how something so obvious to himself could be completely lost on them. He glanced over to where the hollow frame of Jiraiya's dream was now fully fledged out into a cozy home thanks to the efforts of Naruto's Kage Bunshin and chuckled. I guess I'll just have to start very, very simple. Naruto-chan, why did you choose to build this now, and not before when I had suggested it? Naruto lifted his head to peer at the fruits of his labors, lifting one shoulder in a morose shrug. "'Cause, I wanted to do it for Hinata. She deserves it." "Why?" Naruto's whiskered face scrunched with confusion, thinking that it should be obvious. "Well, I don't want her to sleep on the floor." "Why?" Pa persisted. "I want her to be comfortable?" Naruto scratched his head, sensing that there was more to this basic question but unable to follow. "Why?" Naruto squinted, pausing to pick at the calluses on his hands before he answered. "Because, when she hurts, I hurt too." Fukasaku nodded encouragingly. "Now we are getting somewhere. And when she's happy you feel happy, Naruto snorted at the understatement. "When she's happy I feel amazing." His hand pressed onto his chest, just the idea of her smile making the weight on his shoulders lift slightly. "Amazing enough to build her a house? A house that you couldn't bear to look at a week ago? You'd be willing to set aside your own discomfort just so she can sleep in a bed of her own?" Naruto's gaze sharpened and his voice got louder. "Well yeah, it's the least I could do. I mean, she was willing to die for me. I can never repay her for something like that. This house is nothing in comparison." Fukasaku closed his eyes, tapping his chin thoughtfully as he pretended to weigh the worth of Naruto's declaration. "So this project is just about repaying your debt?" Naruto stiffened in offense. "What? No. I do wish I could repay her, but it's more than just that. I want to do this for her because I need her to be happy. I need to know that I can make her happy. It's like, she makes me think, what if, you know?" Pa did know. He knew exactly what Naruto was trying, and failing very badly, to say. But he just sat still on his leaf and did his best to maintain a slightly bewildered expression as the boy exasperatedly waved his arms in the air and struggled profusely to find the perfect words to describe the very emotion he claimed to not possess. Like, what if I lost her? Or, what if she wanted to stay? What if she realizes what an idiot I am? But then what if she doesn't care? What if I can't protect her? What if only I can? What if she stops loving me? What if she never stops? What if I let her down? And what if I spent the rest of my life trying not to? 'Cause I would, I will. I'll spend every waking moment from now until I die doing anything I can to justify her love. Naruto's eyes widened with each statement, dread and hope warring in his mind as his imagination ran wild. He was breathing harshly with the fervor of his announcement, the fire that was gone burning brightly in his eyes once more. His fist clasped over his heart as he straightened proudly after his final declaration. Fukasaku smirked, knowing he only had to ask one more question. Why, Naruto-chan? Because, Naruto blustered. His mind grasped desperately at the fleeting feelings which swirled together, then suddenly latched onto them with startling certainty. His rapid breaths slowed, his whole body went still as stone. His feet felt like they were standing on clouds. His heart soared with the newfound clarity. Because, I love her, he whispered. Wonder filled his mind and it felt like his stomach had fallen out of his body to free fall down the hill. I love Hinata. Not in a date at Ichiraku's kind of way, although that does sound awesome. In a stay forever by my side kind of way. A welcome home kind of way. A let's make a family together kind of way. The last thought had his face erupting into a fierce blush that made Fukasaku burst out into laughter loud enough to catch all the clones' attention, and Naruto spluttered out orders for them to get back to work and stop suspiciously staring at him. Naruto-chan, you may not be a genius at jutsu, or academics, or politics, or whatever else it is you humans are always judging worth by. But you are absolutely a genius at love. Fukasaku wiped away a tear from his eye as his laughter continued to bubble out and he fixed the flustered teenager with a genuine smile. Don't give me that look like I'm just some mushy character in one of Jiraiya's dirty novels. I am old and wise, damn it. And I can say with absolute certainty that love, in all of its many, many forms, is the foundation of all your greatest strengths. Snatching a meandering dragonfly out of the air with his tongue, the toad sage's eyes twinkled with mischief while he chewed and watched Naruto's face contort with each dawning realization of his heart. It sure took you a hell of a lot longer than most to figure out real romantic love. Maybe you should have read those Icha books a little more carefully, Fukasaku snickered around his mouthful. Naruto nearly choked in outraged embarrassment, but then two clones ran over and demanded the log he was sitting on, and he could only mumble petulantly as he helped them carry the last part over to be cut into boards. The remainder of the afternoon passed with Naruto darting around the clearing, supervising his small workforce of clones while Pa watched lazily from his leaf. By the time Fukasaku remembered that they were probably late enough to dinner that Ma would definitely be yelling at them, the cabin was almost complete and nearly habitable. As the pair of sages packed up to descend the hill for the day, Naruto gave the clones instructions to stay and work on some finishing touches. He wanted an iori lined with stones from the river, a large stump fashioned into a low table, and some sort of bed frame so Hinata wouldn't have to sleep on the dirt floor. Tired satisfaction thrummed in Naruto's chest as he carried Pa Toad down the winding trail that zigzagged into the valley where their dinner awaited. His emotions and muscles ached with overuse, leaving his brain feeling fuzzy in a floaty way that made him nervous but excited. The t-shirt full of mushrooms tied to his belt thudded against the side of his leg with every step, and he smiled imagining the appreciation in Hinata's eyes at the non-winged or wormy food. If she was feeling well enough, maybe he would carry her up the hill and show her the house. Or maybe it would be better to wait until daylight? Remembering the less than easy trek they had made through the darkness last night, Naruto thought maybe it would be better to let her rest in safety without him running the risk of stranding them somewhere in the forest along the still somewhat unfamiliar trail. Plus, that would give him at least one more night to come to terms with his newest realization. Part of him wanted to run and blurt it out at the top of his lungs as soon as he laid eyes on her. And part of him shrank at the idea of laying himself so bare to her, which made no sense whatsoever since she had already done that exact thing. He just felt like he needed to make it more perfect. More safe. If he was going to say those words to her, he wanted to be able to back them up. To offer her all of himself and more. More than nothing. More than the life of a fugitive. More than just an almost hero. He just needed one more day. Perhaps he would sneak back into Konoha, get some supplies, and see what was happening. Try to discover if there was any hope of fixing his mistake with the Hyuga. One more day to try and make things perfect. Arriving at the short hut of Ma and Pa home, he let the old toad hop off his back. Swinging the door to the warm hut open, Naruto ducked through as light poured out into the quickly darkening dusk, calling out aloud, to Daima, like he always did after retiring from a long day of training over the last few weeks. But this time it wasn't Shima's shrill croak that greeted him. "Okari," Hinata answered softly, lifting her head from where she had been carefully stirring a large pot of stew over a low fire. Naruto's heart skipped as the perfection of her response settled in his gut, and he grinned broadly, beaming with the hope that this could possibly be his future. He couldn't wait. Something felt wrong. An irritating absence replaced an expected comfort. He blindly stretched out, arms sleepily patting the ground of the dark hut in a widening circle. His face scrunched in annoyance when the warmth his subconscious was seeking remained out of reach. Cracking an eye open, Naruto squinted through the crustiness of his sleep, slowly coming out of the fog of his dreams with a distinct feeling of dissatisfaction, the origin of which he thought had something to do with the cold blanket next to him. Rolling over onto his stomach, he groggily propped himself up on his elbows, grinding his fists into his eyes as his spine popped from bottom to top after a long night of death-like sleep on the hard floor. Naruto glared at the neatly folded blanket until a jaw-cracking yawn split his face, trying to remember what felt so off. "Damn, my neck," he groaned internally, sliding a hand over tight muscles as he rolled his head sideways. "I can't wait until I can sleep in a normal bed again." His eyes popped open and his hand froze as multiple memories which had been disguised as dreams resurfaced. The house. The clones are done. Hinata? Lurching out of his tangled blanket, Naruto nearly forgot to slide on his pants before crawling out the door and starting to search for her chakra. Accomplishing Sage Mode so early in the morning was not easy, and he shook his head roughly to try and clear the cobwebs from his concentration. Resetting his feet and taking a deep breath, Naruto internally concentrated, first steadying the flow of his own chakra network before matching it to the sedated buzz of the awakening natural energy in the nascent day. He found her not far off, sitting on a high leaf facing the edge of the sky that was slowly awakening as well. Naruto exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, his hands relaxing out of tightly clenched fists as he focused on her. Her presence had always been calming, but now in Sage Mode the intricate aspects of her chakra signature permeated through his mind and down to his bones, dyeing his soul in her colors. The nagging sense of something missing, the dissatisfaction, the anxiousness that had hit him as he awoke all melted away, and his feet carried him towards her of their own volition. Like a sunflower following the rays of the day, he traced her warmth through the fog and plant stems, honing in on the radiating sense of serenity that spilled from her high perch. The edge of the horizon was just starting to contemplate morphing from black to blue, settling on a pale gray punctuated by the last of the night's most stubborn stars. Pausing underneath the expansive leaf high overhead, Naruto placed a hand on the sturdy stem as he looked up. Visually all he could see were two dangling feet crossed at the ankle, hanging motionless next to the nearly full moon. But with his Sage Mode he could sense the outline of her chakra, which silhouetted her petite form like the glow of a firefly in the mist. Dipping and dancing to a beatless rhythm, unhurried but restless. The urge to fly with her had his fingers clawing into the plant, and anticipation coiled within his muscles as he braced to leap into the air. The large leaf swung gently as he jumped upon it, landing in a soft crouch to try and absorb the disruptive waves of his arrival. Hinata turned away from her contemplation of the sunrise to look up at him, her cheeks instantly staining pink as her eyes flickered briefly over his bare chest. Naruto had never worn a shirt in Mount Myoboku, the humid heat and physical efforts of his training making anything more than his boxers feel stifling. But where before he had thought nothing of his partial nakedness, now the faintest urge to preen for his audience had him straightening his shoulders as he carefully measured his steps across the dew-slicked plant to her side. "Ohio Hinata," Naruto murmured, his voice still rough with sleep. He sat down close enough that the heat from her leg warmed his own thigh, swinging his feet off the edge like an excited child. The dew seeped through his pants, but he ignored it, all of his attention zeroed in on the soft smile she had just for him. "Ohio Naruto-kun," she answered, her bangs swishing slightly as she shivered. He leaned in close enough to count the lashes on her eyes as they lowered shyly, studying the flush on her face as he drank in her aura. "Are you cold?" The question sounded lame as it hung in the muggy air, but he was nearly dancing in his skin for an excuse to touch her, to see if the hint of euphoria that clung to her chakra felt as good under his fingertips as it did in his brain. Across the tiny filaments of the massive leaf's surface his 2 fingers walked their way behind Hinata's back. Tiptoeing on fingertips, his hand hovered at her opposite hip, contemplating the wisdom of daring to grasp its curve. She was unaware of his trepidation, her lips pressed together, poised over a syllable which stuck in her throat. As he waited for Hinata's response, the orange pigment faded from his face and a measure of his sanity returned. Naruto hesitated, but the temptation to hold her was irresistible, so he simply adjusted his target. Trying to seem as nonchalant as possible, Naruto casually rested his palm on her shoulder and wiggled himself over until she was almost completely tucked under his arm. Hinata stiffened, her slender fingers clawing into the top of her thighs, and Naruto bit his lip, praying she wouldn't pull away. His eyes darted around the slowly brightening morning for some kind of conversational inspiration, wanting to distract her so she would relax and stay put. His mind rifled through a myriad of random topics that all seemed too obvious or too cheesy. The weather was nice, her hair looked good, did she sleep well? Lame, all lame, think damn it. Suddenly a light bulb blinked on in his dim mind and he nearly snapped his fingers in epiphany. I was thinking of sneaking back into Konoha for a bit and grabbing some supplies for us. Is there anything you want in particular? I mean, I have no idea what's left there, or how much, but I can try. Can you take me back? Naruto's arm instantly tightened. Hell no. He spat out on reflex, his mind too shocked to be heedful of his sharp tone. Hinata's hands fisted, the loose fabric of her pants bunching over her lap. Her head bowed slightly, but her soft voice was firm as she held her ground. Please, Naruto-kun? He barely held back a snort as he briefly looked away, his free hand kneading his forehead while trying to forcefully relax the scowl from his features. And let your dad try to seal you again? Naruto was unable to disguise the way his voice pitched higher with incredulity. How could she think he would consider sending her back there for even a second? How could she ask him to just abandon her like that? Didn't she want to be with him? The palm of his hand, which was still clutching her slightly stooped shoulder, started to sweat as a sickening feeling settled in the bottom of his stomach. It was too good to be true. She's already having second thoughts. I should have known better than to get my hopes up. Involuntarily pulling her small frame even deeper into the curve of his torso, Naruto could feel her body trembling. Her knuckles were nearly white from the tension in her fisted hands. The silence stretched out between them, his stomach churning and her shoulders rising closer and closer to her ears, like she was slowly withdrawing into a shell. Naruto studied her, his brow furrowing deeply. Unlike before, when her entire countenance had blossomed during her honest confession, this new request had left Hinata hunching and hiding her face from him. Through the blur of his dismay, doubt began to emerge. The conviction she was trying to convey was being contradicted in every aspect of her body language. Gently reaching up to pinch her chin in his hand, Naruto drew her face upwards until she was forced to look him straight on. Hinata's eyes skittered over his features, delaying the inevitable eye contact. But he held her unflinchingly, pressed so closely into his side he could feel her rapid, shallow breaths against his own ribs. When their gazes finally locked, she froze. His irritation stuttered as Naruto marveled at the iridescent hues hidden in her white irises, encircling the palest pupils he had ever seen, which even now dilated under his unwavering attention. They held no guile and animosity that he could see, no disgust or disappointment. Nothing to support his fears of losing her before he could ever ask her to be his. His guarded heart began to melt, the innate perseverance to never give up fortifying his patience to urge the truth out of her own restrained nature. Softly, without any accusation or reproach, he swallowed hard before asking, "Tell me the truth, Hinata. Do you not want to stay with me? Because if you don't, I'll find somewhere else that is safe. But I refuse to send you back to the Hyuga. I won't let them, or anyone, hurt you." Hinata's eyes trembled and watered mutinously. She clamped her lips together tightly, but the twisting hint of a frown still pulled at the corners of her mouth. Naruto's heartbeat slowed its panicked pace as he watched her lose an internal struggle, one crumpling feature at a time. With an abrupt jerk of her head, she freed herself from him and buried her face in her hands, hiding the blush that now traveled all the way to the tips of her ears and attempting to smother a sniffle. Of course I want to stay with you, Naruto-kun, she moaned into her palms. The rest of her words were undecipherable between her muffling fingers, but something that sort of sounded like, "It's all I've ever wanted," made his stomach flip all the way up into his throat from the pit of despair it had fallen into. But I'm not a toad summoner like you," Hinata whimpered. "I don't belong in Mount Myoboku, I'm a burden here. Everyone has been so kind, but you don't owe me anything." A much louder sniffle punctuated the end of her statement, and Naruto frowned deeply. Grasping her wrists and pulling her hands away with less tenderness than before, he scowled at the sad expression marring her normally peaceful face. "What are you talking about?" he chided. "If anything, I owe you for standing up for me. If not for your words I wouldn't be alive, or even here with you now." A blonde eyebrow raised in suspicion as he leaned in closely. "Is it Shima's food? 'Cause I get it, the bugs are hard to swallow, literally, but..." Hinata's hair swished violently as she cut him off with a shake of her head. "No, and you know that's not why I did all that. You're not indebted to me." He stared at her, the rapid pulses in her wrists thrumming under his fingertips. She had told him, in no uncertain terms, exactly why she had joined him to fight the Akatsuki. He didn't think that had changed in the last few days. He hoped it hadn't. As Naruto appraised her subtle body language and half-statements, trying to see underneath of this moment, Hinata dared to lift her eyes and peek at him from under the fringe of her hair. Her eyes were reactive where she was subdued, honest where she was withdrawn, bold where she was muted. Their lack of color belied the vibrancy of her gaze like a celestial trick of the light. The longer Naruto admired the windows of her soul, the clearer he could see the landscape of her heart. No, she still feels the same, he thought, relishing the certainty of his own conclusion as it filled him better than a bowl of warm ramen after an arduous mission away from home. His entire body relaxed in relief and he released her wrists. Instead, his hands searched for ways to comfort her, to reassure her, to infuse her with confidence using more than just his words. Very gently he tucked her hair behind each ear, intentionally brushing his knuckles across the silky skin on her cheekbones. "I know why you helped me, Hinata. Believe me, I understand completely. It's exactly the same reason why I need you to stay here. With me, I couldn't handle it if something were to happen." His voice faltered under that train of thought, and he cleared his throat harshly as he pulled his legs up and shifted sideways on the leaf to face her fully. He licked his lips, quickly rephrasing as her eyebrows rose at the force of his emotion. "I need to know you're safe, Hinata. Please, stay?" She studied him for a moment, chewing on her lip. His own mouth was melting into a pout to put all pouts to shame. Remorselessly begging her with his best puppy dog eyes as he grabbed her hands and prayerfully enfolded them into his own. "I don't want to be a burden to anyone," Hinata whispered reluctantly. "I didn't fight pain so that I could hold it over your head forever in return for endless favors. Hinata, you're not a burden." Naruto barked in exasperation, his hands snapping to her shoulders as he fought the urge to shake her. "And I know you didn't have any hidden motives that day. You're the most genuine person I've ever met. I can see it in your eyes. I can hear it in your voice. I can feel it in your chakra." He chuckled derisively, his thumbs absently kneading her shoulders. "It's kinda nice actually. I've never had such an easy time understanding someone before. It's one of the things I love about you." The laughter died in his throat as the near confession that had slipped out of his mouth registered in Naruto's brain. The two awkwardly gawked at one another with matching wide eyes and pink cheeks, each contemplating the potential weight behind his seemingly superficial compliment. "Shit, that's not how I wanted to do this. What do I do? What do I do?" "You do?" Hinata's lips barely moved as she spoke, her fingers twisting into the hem of her jacket, barely breathing as she waited for his answer. His heart was pounding against his ribs, begging to reveal his feelings. But his brain kept it caged, unwilling to risk such a confession as he sat here empty-handed. Licking his suddenly dry lips as his hands pulled away, Naruto self-consciously scratched at the back of his neck, trying to come up with a safe response that didn't let her down but still let him save those three special words for a more perfect moment. As his thoughts spiraled, the sparkle in Hinata's eyes began to dim with each drawn-out second of silence. Abruptly she turned away from him to face the rising sun, blinking rapidly either from the brightening day or to hold back the tears which threatened to fall. With a start, Naruto suddenly straightened, a flash of guilt crossing his face. The absolute last thing he wanted to do was hurt her. Scooching back to Hinata's side, he leaned into her, intentionally invading her space with a soft bump of his shoulder and knock of his knee. Absolutely, Hinata, he stated with fervor, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his statement on the shell of her ear as well as her fragile heart. You're my most precious person. Nothing happened. A breeze passed between the plants, rocking them back and forth over the dancing blades of unearthly tall grass. But Hinata remained still as stone, vacantly watching the dawn chase the fog away in introspective silence. For a moment Naruto worried that she had shut him out, that his hesitation had broken a fragile thread that was only just starting to knit them together, binding tighter each day, but yet untested and still easily frayed. Then, almost as slowly as the caterpillar that was now creeping along the edge of their leaf, her hand inched across her lap and tentatively touched his clenched fingers. Fire spread along his skin and Naruto flipped his hand over to seize hers in an instant, exhaling harshly in relief. The clouds mirrored the pink hue of Hinata's cheeks at his unashamed sigh, but a burden had fallen from his soul with her simple gesture. So engrossed was he in admiring the feel of her in his grasp that when she spoke, her quiet voice caught him by surprise. You're my most precious person too, Naruto-kun. I'll stay here and wait for you, as long as it takes. If he had wings, Naruto would have flown to Konoha on the power of those whispered words. A beaming grin that rivaled the sunrise spread over his face as Hinata timidly interlaced her slender fingers with his calloused ones, one by one. They sat contentedly together, allowing themselves to become accustomed to the sensation of simply holding the other's hand. The added element of mutual tenderness in what thus far had been a rather whirlwind-like and mostly one-sided romance felt like a breath of fresh air. And each inhalation was easier than the last as they peacefully watched the early birds poke about in the grass for the juiciest worm. Hinata giggled when the caterpillar began to feast voraciously upon their perch, neatly carving out row after row of its breakfast. When a young toad lurched past and nearly upset their seats, dead set on its chase of a particularly agile dragonfly, Naruto shouted angrily for him to watch where he was going. But he couldn't keep the scowl on his face when the startled amphibian underestimated his prey, latching his tongue onto the large bug only to be hauled off through the air and carried away over the leaftops. The poor toad's fading howls were quickly drowned out by Naruto's riotous amusement. Perhaps the spectacle of all nature feasting around them was having an impact on Hinata, for even over her own ringing laughter the growl of her stomach was unmistakable. Naruto snickered and poked her complaining belly with his finger, making her gasp. I knew you were hungry, he accused jokingly. Shima may be the best cook in Mount Myoboku, but that doesn't mean her food is satisfying. It's just edible. The dramatic air quotes he made with his free hand insinuated exactly to what degree Naruto felt the word applied, and Hinata's mouth twisted with a suppressed grin. Beggars can't be choosers, she sighed, her smile fading as once more the reminder of her helplessness arose. Naruto poked her again, harder. Stop it, you're not a beggar. You're just a temporary nomad. Besides, like I was saying, I'm gonna go to Konoha and get some stuff for us to get us settled. Actually, I probably should get going. His fidgeting was increasing again, mental lists of who to talk with, what to grab, and where to find it all criss-crossing with his excitement. The sooner he left, the sooner he would be back to show her the house, and the sooner he could tell her everything. Unable to wait any longer, Naruto gave her hand a final squeeze before pulling his legs up and preparing to jump back across the leaftops to find Pa Toad, when he paused. Hinata's brow was furrowed, her eyes distant with deep thoughts that could hold an untold variety of concerns. When she noticed his hesitation, she quickly spread a caring smile on her face, but still, leaving her like this just didn't feel right. Before he could think about it too hard, Naruto threw his arms around her middle, yanking her up off the plant and against his chest until she squeaked in his ear as the leaf tilted dangerously under their uneven weight. I'll be back as soon as I can, Hinata. Believe it, he shouted, the volume of his voice reflecting the height of his excitement. The birds below startled up into the now bright blue sky, and Hinata flinched in his vice-like hug. Releasing her before he completely lost his mind, Naruto hightailed it back to the hut, his face burning with a fierce blush that nearly blotted out the whisker marks on his cheeks. The last thing Hinata heard him say as she clung to the violently swaying leaf was some sort of kind-hearted threat that she had better take it easy and get some rest. Then, in a blur of blonde hair and orange pants, The most unpredictable man she had ever known was gone. "Be careful," she murmured into the empty air, her mouth belatedly delivering the message from her flustered brain. How was it that she always felt like a discombobulated mess around him? If only she was better at expressing herself, half of her anxiety around him would probably disappear. Flopping onto her back, Hinata stared blankly up at the clouds as they slowly rolled across the atmosphere, carefree and weightless. No wonder Shikamaru was always saying he was jealous of them. Clouds had no feelings. Clouds had no fears. Nothing to hinder them on their journey through space. No one to turn their worlds upside down. No one to cage them. Raising a finger to her forehead, Hinata traced the skin where the crooked cross of the cage bird seal had emerged and then faded away. The echoes of her father's disappointment were always reverberating in the corners of her mind. But here, in this almost mythical jungle, the voice in her head that always shamed her failures was paling in comparison to the whisper in her soul which chanted Naruto-kun's words. "It's one of the things I love about you. You're my most precious person. I need you." It was like he was bending the bars of the cage around her heart one statement at a time, freeing her inch by inch, moment by moment. Hinata had never doubted the love she carried for Naruto-kun, carefully guarding and nurturing it in isolation. Only in her wildest dreams had she been able to muster the courage to hand him the key to the gilded cage containing her greatest secret. Fear of his rejection had made her hide her admiration for years, content to admire him from afar. That fear had eaten her nerve until her fingers trailed down over her chest, pressing into the tender wound that lay dangerously close to her heart. In the moments before she had sprinted down the steep slope of the smoking crater, her all-seeing eyes had watched Naruto-kun lose himself. Lose his determination, his nindo, his hope. For the first time in her life, she had forgotten to be afraid of her own failure. She had been ready to accept death until Hinata's hand fisted over her stomach as it twisted, resurfacing memories of Naruto-kun's visit to her flimsy tent the night after the battle played out in her mind. The intensity of his gaze nearly pinning her to that creaky cot. The rawness of his emotions as he demanded she say it again. The way his expression had split open in awe at her response. He saw her, and it had been more than she had dared to hope for. When her father had begun to seal her, she had thought those precious moments with Naruto-kun would be enough to carry her through a lifetime of branch house servitude. Just having her love acknowledged was enough, until heat flushed up her neck to her face, and Hinata bashfully lifted her hand to touch her flaming cheek where it had rested on Naruto-kun's strong chest as he had carried her through the dark jungle on their first night here. Even in the moonlight she had noticed his equally strong blush when she had been pinned against him by those plants. While he had held her tightly in his arms and been working to free them, Hinata had experienced an epiphany. Hinata wanted more, not just the chance to confess, but to hear him say it back. She wanted to love and be loved. She wanted to unleash her heart without fear that it would fall and break. She wanted to leave her cage. She had hoped Naruto-kun wanted it as well. But yesterday he had completely disappeared. Been gone for hours without a single word. And when he had returned last night, smiling but dog-tired, he had barely made it through dinner without nodding off. With a muttered good night he had crawled onto his mat and instantly fallen asleep, leaving Hinata to wonder if perhaps this dream was also doomed to never come true. She thought it was all in her imagination, all just a one-sided crush that would never amount to anything more. That she was only still by his side out of pity and obligation. Until, hugging her chest lest it burst, girlish giggles bubbled up from within as Hinata rolled onto her side and squealed, disturbing the hungry caterpillar in his ravenous demolition of her leafy oasis. Earlier, this large plant had seemed like a good spot to think and brood upon her doomed future, only to become the scene of something unexpected yet glorious. His touches were more than friendly, laced with a tenderness that caused her stomach to erupt with butterflies. The sincerity of his simple words made her head swim. He had nearly said it. "I just have to be patient," Hinata concluded, flopping onto her back with a breathy sigh. Serenity followed on the tail of her internal resolve, solidifying into a peace of mind that healed her inside and out. I need to let him work it out on his own. Uncoerced, unhurried, until maybe he will say it, too. Sitting up, Hinata closed her eyes and basked in the delicious warmth of the sun, drinking it in as her soul danced under its nurturing rays. She could wait. It would be worth it. He was worth it, and it would be that much sweeter in the end. After all, love was not a cage. Naruto cringed as he crawled out of the toad's sticky mouth, biting the inside of his cheek to hold back an annoyed complaint about the unpleasant mode of travel which had brought him back to the land of fire. His fingers sank into the cool mud with a wet squelch as he pulled himself free while trying to avoid dragging all of his clothes through the muck. If it was good enough for Ero Sennin, it's good enough for me, he sternly reminded himself. A fat drop of warm water that was mixed with grossness splattered heavily on the back of his neck, running under his collar and down his spine while he tried to slither onto the banks of the pond with as much dignity as possible. He was glad Shima had suggested he keep his sage cloak folded in his pack until arrival. Shuddering, he chanted internally, "I am the Toad Sage. I am the Toad Sage. I do not vomit in front of the little frogs. I do not vomit over a little spit." Watching him with varying degrees of amusement was a small herd of frogs and toads ranging in size from the breadth of his thumbnail to a small dog. Their bulgy eyes followed him with immense judgment as he clambered out of the reeds and began shaking out his cloak while taking deep breaths in through his nose and out of his mouth. Naruto could have sworn he heard a few giggles and barely stopped himself from pouting in humiliation. With a final shake of his head which sent gooey droplets flying and made his blonde spikes defy gravity once more, Naruto donned the cloak edged in black flames and turned to thank Gamamoto for the ride. "Don't forget this," the old toad croaked in a monotone voice before his long tongue lashed out to deposit the massive sage scroll into Naruto's waiting arms. He caught it deftly but fumbled a bit to secure it behind his back. The sight of the familiar item that he had stared at as a child, following Ero Sennin's tall back through miles of roads all over the land of fire, still made his fingers tremble. This chakra-laced scroll bore the blood oaths of himself, his father, his mentor, and many generations of other summoners. It now held a different kind of sanctity in his regard compared to when he was a child and just thought of it as another cool status symbol of power. "Thanks Gamamoto," Naruto said with a shaky smile. The toad stared at him, glassy eyes traveling up and down, assessing the uneasy set of his shoulders which carried the cloak and scroll of his new role. A low chuckle rasped out with a few extra bubbles, and the transport toad gave Naruto a broad wink before sinking wordlessly beneath the murky water. Naruto blinked in surprise, then relaxed with a soft laugh of his own. Striking what he hoped looked like a confident pose and planting his fists firmly on his hips, the genin successor of the Sannin grinned as he turned to address the group of gathered amphibians. "Alright, is everyone here?" Naruto boomed over the small clearing. Numerous summons covered the lily pads, rocks, and low branches surrounding the pond. A few even clung to the high reeds like children clambering atop their parents' shoulders to see. He hummed approvingly at their eager attention. "Perfect. For the next 2 hours scatter throughout Konoha and report back to me anything that you hear. How are the food supplies? Building materials? Are any vendors up and running? Focus on the Hyuga and any Anbu you can spot. Do not engage with anyone, even if they seem familiar. I only need your eyes and ears right now. After I have your intel I will make a quick run through the village myself and gather what I need before heading back." "Got it?" A chorus answered him in a range of croaks, ribbits, and even a few squeaky highs. With a sharp nod and a smirk, Naruto pointed toward the direction of the village. "Okay, dismissed." In an instant he was alone in the forest with only the whisper of the trees and the faint chirping of the birds to answer his command. Chuckling as he ran a finger under his nose, Naruto adjusted the unfamiliar tension of the thick leather strap across his chest, marveling again that he was now the one giving out orders to the toad summons. It had been Fukasaku's suggestion to have the small spies scout the village first before entering it himself. The idea hadn't occurred to Naruto. His instincts leaned toward using his numerous clones and the memory transfer they gave him to do recon. But assuming that, at the very least, every single Hyuga would be looking for him, the pure chakra-based Kage Bunshin would be easy to spot in the blink of a Byakugan. While he himself could hide his chakra for a period of time, providing the Kyuubi wasn't being an ass, a clone could not. Besides, as the only living human toad sage, Naruto had inherited a few perks along with his morning. One of them being a spy network unrivaled the world over. Raising a hand to shade his eyes, Naruto squinted up at the height of the sun in the sky and estimated he would have plenty of time to lay a few game traps and gather them before heading back to Mount Myoboku. The type of carnivorous diet that Shima preferred was not something he was looking forward to eating for another untold number of weeks. His time doing sage training had been more than enough to gain an appreciation for the fact that he dwelt a bit higher on the food chain, and did not need to resort to devouring insects as a source of protein. Plus there was something very ego-satisfying about the idea of bringing home some fresh meat to present to Hinata. Rubbing his hands together, he strode out of the small clearing and into the thicker part of the forest with the air of a caveman setting out to provide for his woman in order to win her heart. The concept of needing to provide for someone was new and slightly stressful, but the idea of having someone waiting for him, eagerly anticipating his return, made Naruto's heart skip a beat with excitement. His bounding leaps across the high branches took on an urgency fueled by his desire to not disappoint her. To make her proud. To bring a satisfied smile to her face by sating her hunger with delicious food. He latched onto the desire to hurry back to her side, using it to try and push down the anxiety that was running through the back of his mind like an undercurrent. When Hinata was with him, his mind felt warmly fuzzy and all the worries that were constantly leeching at his focus were easier to keep at bay. The painful memories that had been ambushing his emotions at every turn over the last few days seemed to scab over, and finally begin to heal. Even now as he paused to scan the forest floor for prime places to lay his traps, the bite of the rough bark under his palms, the tickle of the leaves against his arms, the struggle to not breathe too loudly, all took him back to a darker time. The task of hiding for survival was steeped in childhood nostalgia for the longtime village pariah, and repeating that scenario in the present was scraping at old scars upon his soul which had never healed completely. The not-so-sweet familiarity of being forced to hunt for food also caused his mind to wander along less than pleasant paths. Once, the forest had been his refuge from the abuse of the orphanage, his land of plenty when he was starving, and his playground when the hatred in other parents' eyes drove him away from potential playmates. There had been times when the fish he had learned to catch after days of trial and error were his only meal. While his peers were chasing one another across the playground in a game of tag, he had been chasing down rabbits until he was nearly dying of exhaustion. While they engaged in joyous rounds of hide-and-go-seek at the park, he had been stealing apples from the market and desperately dodging Anbu. But things are different now, Naruto reminded himself as he reached into his pouch and felt the generous lengths of ninja wire and sharp kunai at his fingertips. Tools he never had when attempting this before and now would make his hunt that much easier. Tools he had earned as a shinobi of Konoha. A shinobi who could hold his head high instead of skulk in the shadows. At least, until recently. Pulling his hand free, Naruto let his fingertips slide over the folds of his sage cloak as it puddled around his crouched form. The fabric was sturdy but not heavy, the fine threads from the special silkworms in Mount Myoboku were woven tightly together in a fabric that was practically unbreakable. Rubbing the smooth texture between his fingers, Naruto smiled morosely. At least the toads would never turn him away. Never disown him. No matter what happened in the future between himself and Konoha, he knew he could always go back to the little hut on the banks of the clear river in Mount Myoboku. His eyes lifted, flicking around distractedly until he spotted a promising place for his first trap on the side of a small slope across the way. Rising to his feet, Naruto started jumping from limb to limb without really looking where he was going. A bird swooped out of the canopy in a steep dive right past his face, snapping Naruto out of his daze just as he brushed past a small nest full of eggs. Twisting out of the way at the last second, he barely caught the next limb with his hands, swinging like a trapeze artist to save his neck from a high fall. The bird circled his head and screeched at him as he hung by his fingernails, harshly flapping her wings with no appreciation whatsoever for his death-defying maneuver. Naruto shook his head side to side, squinting to save his eyes from all the feathers until the bird deemed him no longer threatening and settled back upon her perch. She leveled him with a sharp scowl that he matched, sticking out his tongue just as she turned away. "Relax, geez, like I'd want to eat those puny eggs," he grumbled before flipping back upright in a much more graceful move than before. Even at his most hungry, he had never been able to stomach stealing baby bird eggs right out of the nest. Straightening his hite-8 and pulling a feather out of his hair, Naruto turned his back on the potential site for his trap. All that squawking had probably alerted every creature nearby to his presence, so he might as well move on. The idea of using his sage mode to easily pinpoint a rabbit in a burrow crossed his mind, But Naruto shook off the idea. It felt like cheating to use the perfect balance of natural energy to hunt nature itself, and even though he was hungry, he was not starving. There's some hypocritical irony for you. A human, who is meant to be a weapon used by humans to kill other humans, and yet he won't use natural energy to kill a stupid rabbit, or take a little egg to simply feed himself. Your idiotic philosophies never cease to amaze me, mortal. Naruto nearly slipped a second time, startled by the sudden opinion from the dark voice deep in his gut. His hand pressed into his abdomen suspiciously, but he forced himself to keep searching the forest and ignore it, instead focusing on making his way carefully through the trees. The last thing he felt like doing was starting a moral debate with the Kyuubi right now. Refocusing, Naruto soon spotted a massive tree with roots arching gently up out of the ground, making a perfect little crevice for his snare, and went to work quickly and efficiently. His lips twisted as he concentrated, making sure the wire wasn't too obvious as he carefully tucked it under some dried leaves without disturbing the area too much. Soon he was lost in the muscle memory of the motions, and once it was complete moved on hurriedly so he could set as many traps as possible across a broad area of forest. At each strategic place he would carefully tiptoe around the foliage, trying to leave behind very little scent or any other sign of a human's presence. But it seemed the Kyuubi had no intention of allowing the Jinchuriki to simply ignore his captive's harassment. As Naruto's hands busied themselves with tying down the final thin branch of his last trap at just the right angle, the intrusive voice again murmured his own bitter contribution to the reminiscence of the moment. And yet again, here you are scrounging for food like a dog. No, even dogs are treated with more respect than you. They watched a child starve. They called you a demon for years and a hero for a day. Stronger shinobi than you have been shunned by their village. Greater heroes have been killed by my own hand. Do you even want to return to that place? To subject yourself and your mate to their judgments? Unbidden, the hateful shouts of various grocers as they chased him out of one food stall after another echoed in Naruto's mind. He could almost feel the burn of his skinny legs as he dodged the rotten fruit hurled at him, the hot tears that ran down his cheeks, the ache of a stomach that was never full enough. Even years later, the sharp pangs of hunger and hurt feelings made his throat tighten. The images of faces twisted with disgust and fear swam before his awareness. Faces of adults, children, shinobi, Hiyashi. They purposefully lied to you. You suffered in anonymity when you were the son of a Hokage. And now the Hyuga are disgracing Hinata the same way, by taking away her birthright, her name, her rank, everything. They don't deserve your mercy. Naruto's hands froze, his slitting eyes staring blankly as serrated breaths tore out of his dry mouth. He no longer saw the ninja wire looped over his calloused fingers, but bloodied rags tied around the split knuckles of his tiny hands after he had fought off yet another genin who thought it would be fun to prove his toughness by beating on the scrawny little demon child. It's true, he seethed, fisting his hands. The bite of his sharpening nails added a layer of tactile pain to the overwhelming flashback. If they had known I was the son of the Yondaime, I would never have had to scrounge for food to survive. The hateful glares, the exorbitant food prices, the rotten produce. I would never have had to starve. Never would have been shunned. I would have had friends. The Hyuga would respect me because of my name, and then I could force them to change. I could protect Hinata from that seal, and if anyone tried to lay a finger on her I would tear them limb from limb. The tidal wave of anger carried him away, and the satisfying memory of sweeping Hinata away from her father as the powerful red chakra enveloped them both suddenly flashed through Naruto's slipping consciousness. The guttural urge to slaughter their enemies even as he gathered her up in his arms flowed through him. She had clung to him so tightly in that moment, grabbing his face and crying out. Something. Wait! What had she said? Naruto-kun, stay with me. Gah, damn it! Naruto bellowed out loud, clapping his face so hard with both hands that his cheeks stung and buzzed. The muscles in his hunched back trembled as his chest heaved with exertion from the battle that was taking place within his soul. The pounding of his heart against his ribs was as powerful as the thrashing of the fox's tails against the seal. Sweat trickled down his temple as he forced himself to take slow, even breaths. Hinata had not wanted him to rage with demonic revenge, she had wanted him to be himself. He had to be strong for her. Naruto grimaced, his ears ringing with the Kyuubi's furious reaction to the nearly successful attempt at overtaking his emotions. Normally the Biju only attacked his sanity in the heat of battle, not when he least expected a fight, alone in the middle of a peaceful forest. As clarity returned to his head, Naruto snarled with the realization that the cunning fox had dared to use his new feelings for Hinata to try and distort his awareness with a hateful perspective. The tang of blood stained his tongue and Naruto hesitantly lifted a hand to his lip. The accusing red liquid on his fingertip testified to his poor control. A fang had lengthened with the dark turn of his mind, and Naruto growled in self-disgust. He hated losing to the demon within more than anyone else. Hated it when his rationality was stolen. Hated that he was his own worst enemy at any given moment. It's so much easier to ignore this shit when I'm not alone, Naruto mentally moaned. I had to get back to Hinata. After everything that's happened, the loneliness stings so much more now that I know what I'm missing. Shaking his head violently to banish the last rumblings of the manipulative voice back into the recesses of his mind, the Jinchuriki tried to steady his nerves and hands once more, and again attempted to set his delicate trap. Besides, being angry over what I can't change will never help me get stronger. While his burden of harboring the 9 tails had made for a hellish childhood, Naruto would never have wanted to be admired for something he did not earn. In his mind, the idea of living his life being spoiled as the Hokage's son was lame compared to being respected as a powerful shinobi of merit. The branch slipped out of his still shaking fingers, almost slapping leaves across his eyes. Naruto's nostrils flared as he reached again to grab the branch, his mouth pressing into a thin line. If he were completely honest, it would probably always sting when he wondered why those he trusted had thought allowing an orphan to suffer in loneliness would be better than revealing the precious truth of his birth. Working the fine wire around the tip of the branch with forced steadiness, Naruto's mouth pulled into a deeper frown. His brows creased with concentration as he struggled to balance everything, inside and out of his head. How much easier would it have been to endure everything if he had grown up knowing he had been loved and not abandoned? What kind of critical difference would it have made if he believed that he had been entrusted with a grave responsibility because of that immense love, instead of cursed by Kami? If he had never felt the burning need to seek attention from anyone in any way possible, because deep down he would have known that his father had bestowed upon him enough pride to last a lifetime? What if? Naruto sighed heavily as he stood, backing away from his perfectly balanced snare and brushing away his footprints with a leafy bough he snapped off of a nearby tree. When he deemed himself a safe distance away, he turned his feet toward the sound of a stream bubbling nearby, forcing his thoughts into a new direction along with his steps. Thinking too much on the what-ifs of the past made for a bitter outlook on the future, and even his father had mentioned it would have been dangerous to be associated with the Namikaze name. Yes, his life could have been better. But it also could have been a lot worse if he was constantly being hunted by assassins from all over the 5 shinobi nations. For now, all he wanted was to catch something other than caterpillars for dinner, and focus upon what was happening in the present. My life is confusing enough as it is without trying to fix the past. The minutes slipped by quickly as he redoubled his efforts, using most of his ninja wire to fashion a simple net that he staked across a narrower part of the stream to catch fish riding the current. The cool water refreshed his heated skin and dry throat, and Naruto felt more like himself again after completing his final pass across the stream. By the time the hue of his blue eyes once more matched the bright sky, he was eagerly skipping through the treetops back to the pond where all the summons were eagerly waiting to report their findings. The restless group hushed when Naruto descended out of the leafy canopy and walked across the top of the water to a large rock in the middle of the pond. Gamamoto peeked at the young sage as he nodded to the nearest toad to begin his report, noting the subtle strain he still carried in his shoulders before disappearing once more beneath the water. The sun was warm upon Naruto's back as he patiently listened to every last frog. The intel was as scattered as the routes each summons had taken. Sitting cross-legged atop the boulder, one hand on his knee and the other cradling his chin, he watched a few frogs snatch up nearby insects before returning to Mount Myoboku after finishing their turn. Tapping one finger on his bottom lip, Naruto mentally sifted through the wide range of information they had disclosed, tucking some bits away for later, and prioritizing the parts he needed to accomplish his tasks for today. The Hyuga, as expected, were all on high alert for any sign of the missing couple. One small frog had been able to enter the rapidly reconstructing compound by hiding in the wood being brought in for repairs, and had overheard some branch members reporting back to Hiyashi. So far the clan had searched the remains of Naruto's apartment, the patches of forest within the village perimeter, the training grounds, their teammates' clan compounds, to a certain degree, Kurenai-sensei's apartment complex, and even the bunkers. According to the amphibious spy, Hiyashi had been stoically frustrated at the long list of failures and lack of clues, but refused to give up. He was frowning a lot, the little toad recalled. And after they were done talking, he gave orders for a new group of Hyuga to begin searching the forest beyond the village walls first thing in the morning. I see, guess we weren't a moment too soon in our visit, Naruto hummed thoughtfully before he nodded at the summons. Thank you, that was very helpful. One more thing, Naruto-sama, the young spy exclaimed as she bounced excitedly on her lily pad. Afterwards, Hiyashi sent a messenger to pass on all their findings to a man called Danzo-sama. I don't know who that is, though. That made Naruto pause, his face twisting in confusion at the new information, as well as discomfort at the formal address the lower-ranked toads insisted upon using for him. The man was unfamiliar to Naruto, his name conjuring up only a vague recollection of a few random comments from Sai. But another toad quickly jumped in to explain. Tsunade-sama is in a coma as a result of her overuse of chakra during the invasion. This, Danzo-sama, has stepped in as her replacement. I was following the old Ino Shika-cho team, they were discussing it as they walked to a council meeting. The brown, crusty-looking toad snapped at a passing fly, gulping it down before continuing in his hoarse voice. They were being quiet, so I did not hear everything they said, but it definitely sounds like they do not like this Danzo guy. Nor should they. Water erupted as Gamamoto resurfaced from the darker depths of the water. I worked with Jiraiya-sama for many years, long before any of you frog spawn were ever hatched. Danzo has wanted the hat ever since the Sandame was appointed. He took your father's nomination as Yondaime as a personal offense, he lectured, fixing Naruto with a bulgy eye. His organization, Root, has done more than one dirty deed under his instruction. I would not be surprised if he jumped on this chance to steal the title of Hokage from the Slug Princess while she was down. Naruto straightened, remembering the few things he had gleaned about Root from observing Sai and his abysmal state of interpersonal behavior and abhorrent level of teamwork. Team 7 had managed to slowly crack his shell, but that was still a work in progress. An entire organization of similarly trained and like-minded shinobi could possibly be able to force a significant shift in the government during a time like this. Even someone as dense about politics as Naruto could comprehend that the asshole who raised Sai would make a terrible Hokage. He groaned and rubbed his aching head viciously at the ominous potential of such a scenario. And if the Hyuga are aligning with Danzo in return for help with finding me and Hinata? Naruto's eyes hardened with equal parts frustration and resolve. There was little he could do to help Ba-chan as a fugitive from his own home. Hopefully the few precious people he knew he could trust with his life were working hard to protect the Godem. The same way he was doing his best to protect Hinata. But guilt poked at him despite his attempts to reassure himself. Could he still call himself a shinobi of Konoha if he was actively running away from there? The elders are backing Danzo as well. Another frog called out from a lily pad by the water's edge. She was covered in smooth, glossy skin that looked just like the wood panels in the council chambers, and because of this trait she specialized in breaching the closed doors of many a sensitive meeting. Naruto remembered her frequently whispering in Ero Sennin's ear over the years, and perked up his own at her words. Those two old farts never liked Tsunade-sama, or Jiraiya-sama for that matter, because they were students of the third, she sniffed derisively as she crossed her arms. And as the Toad Sage's disciple, they never considered Minato-sama trustworthy either. All of them feel that the leaf has wandered too far from its roots and needs to go back to the older tradition of militaristic rulership the Nidame Hokage used. Lord Second? What does he have to do with any of this? Naruto's head was starting to throb from all the new information. He had only planned on receiving a status update on the village's reconstruction plus some kind of hint as to how much hot water he was in, not a whole political history lesson on top of doom and gloom. He ground his teeth as flashbacks of sitting through Iruka-sensei's lectures made his temples pound, until a wet tongue slapped the scowl off his face and sent him tumbling backwards off his rock in a cartwheel of arms and legs. Pay attention, Gamamoto scolded sharply. If you want to keep this network from falling apart you need to learn these things. The web is only as strong as the spider who weaves its silk, and like it or not, you're that spider now. If the web fails to catch something important, the consequences will fall on your shoulders. Water dripped from Naruto's spluttering face as he crawled back upon his rock, but the warning had hit home with greater accuracy than the old toad's strike. Yamamoto is right, Naruto admitted to himself as he wrung scummy water out of his cloak with a sigh. The best thing I could do to honor Ero Sennin's memory is to not let all his hard work go to waste. Maintaining this spy ring could be the way I help Konoha from the outside. A way to find Sasuke. Even a way to protect the other Jinchuriki. I have to keep it together. I'm sorry, Naruto apologized sheepishly, standing up and readjusting the weight of the scroll so it settled across his back just the way Ero Sennin used to carry it. The act made his mouth tighten with humility. The scroll was a burden of responsibility as much as a status symbol. Perhaps that was why Ero Sennin had always worn it, despite its cumbersomeness. As a reminder of the promises he carried, and the lives that depended on him. With a somber set of his shoulders, Naruto cleared his throat and straightened. I'm listening, please be patient with me. The toads and frogs that still remained had all frozen, staring at the massive toad who outranked them all and dared to scold the new sage. Yamamoto squinted at the young man who had schooled his features and was now staring back with unblinking eyes, patiently awaiting whatever lesson may come next. His voice carried nothing but sincerity, and with a twitch of his mouth Yamamoto recalled the prophecy of the great sage toad, causing his own tone to soften. Patience you shall have. For now, let them finish their reports. I will add in anything that may be helpful. Thankfully the rest of the information was mostly details about where and what supplies Konoha had, and how much they could spare. Naruto had no desire to create more hungry mouths or make life more difficult than it already was, and wanted to try and take only what he absolutely needed. Several spies reported that many of the supplies were coming from the surrounding towns where Naruto or Team 7 had helped the civilians at one time or another, and it eased his conscience to think that he had contributed in an indirect way. But the news that his own former classmates were seeking him and Hinata just as avidly as her former clan, quickly turned his demeanor south again. Naruto sucked on his sore lip as he raked his fingers over his scalp, anxiety tightening his chest. It couldn't be helped, of course people were going to wonder where the pair had gone. But most of the civilians just assumed their hero's absence was due to some sort of order from the higher-ups. However, Hinata and Naruto's friends were growing more suspicious and worried with each passing day. He crossed his arms, staring at the ripples in the water as the frogs dispelled one by one, all having finished their reports. He remembered how he had felt when Sasuke left, how badly he had wanted answers and how much anger the confusion and betrayal created. The last thing he wanted to do was repeat the same turmoil for their friends. Yamamoto, I'm going into Konoha, Naruto said solemnly. I owe my friends an explanation. I trust them, and it's something I would want if I was in their position. The toad croaked lowly, a slight nod of his head making the lily pads around him bob. I'll summon you back in a few hours if you don't return. But be careful, Naruto-sama. When you have lived as long as I have, you see too many friends become enemies. The ominous, though well-intended, warning lingered in his mind like the bubbles on the water's surface after Yamamoto sank out of sight with the summoning scroll Naruto tossed him protectively curled up in his tongue. With a deep sigh Naruto jumped up into the trees, mentally bracing himself to think like a shinobi, like a spymaster, not like a naive genin. A hardened heart was not so easily tricked or betrayed. He had already seen one friend become a foe, despite his best attempts to prevent it. Ero Sennin had been betrayed by his teammate as well, and ultimately was killed by his former students. Hinata's own family was hunting for her at this very moment, to throw her in a fated cage and toss away the key. And now there was Danzo to worry about. But it went against his nature to not trust the bonds he had worked so hard to finally forge. Even as an abused child he had never questioned his allegiance to his village. The thought of leaving Konoha had never dawned on him because it was all he had ever known. Now he was second-guessing every connection and sneaking back in like some kind of felon, only days after being declared the hero. The continual tug-of-war between loyalty and cautiousness was becoming exhausting, and Naruto couldn't decide which side to root for. Either way his heart suffered. With a grunt Naruto again jumped up into the high branches, pumping his legs faster with each stride. The wind of his speed and the turmoil of his emotions burned his eyes, making them tear up. He ignored the moisture as it streamed across his temples and into his hair, only noticed by the passing leaves. Everything was wrong. For every pro there was a con. For every patriot there was a traitor. For every realization obtained a litany of new questions were released. Naruto longed for the days when he thought his only goal in life was to kick ass and become Hokage. This political shit was for the birds. A harsh chuckle lodged in his tightening throat as a part of him realized that he completely understood how Ero Sennin could have walked away from Konoha for years on end. His feet pounded a familiar rhythm across the branches as he bounded through the forest towards the village, swallowing hard and forcing his concentration back to contemplating the best ways to get what he needed as efficiently as possible. By the time the walls were in sight, Naruto's unacknowledged tears had dried and a plan had been made. Just before stamping down his chakra to a civilian level, he transformed into the simplest henge he could create. Time to put all those years of hiding from Anbu to good use. What exactly am I supposed to be looking for? Neji inquired, his cool tone barely disguising the edge in his voice. He had once more been sent to the far edges of Konoha's suburbs to use his Byakugan to look for precious items. The fact that most of these items consisted of lost teddy bears and family jewels for the village's highest echelon of civilians, who could easily afford replacements, instead of the center of the leaf where the more crucial search and rescue efforts were taking place, was not lost on the Hyuga. He had a hunch his uncle was pawning him out to politically savvy contacts under the advertisement of his Byakugan being the best in the family. The branch family specifically, of course. Just read the list, the genin sighed, tossing him a small scroll before turning to complete his own tasks. That was the other part that had Neji fighting down righteous indignation. He far outranked the other shinobi in this area. Pursing his lips in a tight frown, Neji flipped open the scroll and briefly glanced at the items, a soft snort escaping as his eyes skimmed over the ridiculously long and superfluous list of requests. Definitely paying customers. With a small sigh of resignation, he turned to complete his task, because as much as he hated the fact that it seemed he was intentionally being kept away from the center of the action, Neji was nothing if extremely obedient. Even though he highly suspected that there was an underlying reason he was being placed on the far edges of Konoha, a reason that was more than likely related to his missing cousin, there was little he could do to rebel without paying dearly for the consequences. Case in point, how his cousin became missing. Neji crossed his arms as he channeled chakra into his dojutsu, easily dividing his attention amongst the vast variety of objects in his vicinity down to the most minute detail. There was no challenge at all to finding the innate objects requested. Basic search and rescue was an elementary task that even the youngest Hyuga performed. Thus his mind was able to freely wander over the events of the last few days, unhindered by any of the current work. While Hiyashi had not outright said it, Neji knew the man was watching him like a hawk. As the closest friend of both Hinata and Naruto within the clan, and the one that had allowed the Jinchuriki access to the Hyuga princess that fateful night, he was the center of much suspicion. Neji did not doubt that Hiyashi was sending him to the opposite side of the village to keep him from interfering in any way with the search for the missing pair. Or maybe, to make it easier to watch me in case they do make some kind of contact? The idea had merit, and had Neji shifting his feet constantly in order to keep his head on a swivel and guard his blind spot, watching for spies as well as any of the ridiculous items he had been told to locate. But just like all the days before, no one approached him aside from other shinobi also at work. Nothing out of the ordinary happened. It was the same routine hour after hour. Seek, find, retrieve, seek, find, retrieve, seek. Suddenly a hand clapped him on the back, making his jaw clench at the disruption to his focus. Oi, I think I got something over here. Kinda looks like a fancy, busted carriage. But the wood and wheels are still salvageable, I think. Can you come check it out? The voice was unmistakable, but whipping around it was not the blue eyes and broad grin that he expected to see looking back at him, but just another random shinobi covered in dust and grime like himself. Neji quickly assessed the man's chakra network, but the normally bright tenketsu that were unique to Naruto alone were not visible, and annoyed at his own disappointment more than anything, the Hyuga turned back to his work. I was assigned this section. When I have found what I am looking for, I will come help you. Although it sounds like you already saw what you need to know, Neji murmured, forcing his voice to be as neutral as possible. The middle-aged man hummed thoughtfully behind him. Perhaps, but are you finding what you're really looking for? The cryptic question made Neji pause, slowly looking over his shoulder. The man was smirking in a way that was eerily similar to an unpredictable acquaintance of his, and as he studied the unfamiliar face the warm brown eyes briefly flashed to blue. Actually, I think I do have time to help you with that carriage, Neji stated loudly enough that the foreman of the site only glanced lazily in their direction before dropping his gaze back to the small stack of scrolls piled up on the makeshift table nearby. Within seconds, Neji was following the new shinobi around the corner and into an alley which was mostly blocked by debris. As they walked with forced slowness, his Byakugan was once again scrutinizing the chakra of the broad-shouldered man before him, as well as ensuring that no one was paying any attention as they slipped away. The henge was impeccable, even the chakra network was unrecognizable. Who would have thought that Loudmouth was so good at hiding? But before chasing that train of thought, Neji had other questions that needed answering first. Where is Hinata-sama? He demanded as soon as they reached the blind spot behind the destroyed carriage which blocked the alley. Neji's Byakugan had confirmed that the coast was clear, and the volume of his voice was louder than he expected it to be in the confined space. Naruto held up his hands, not dropping his henge as he backed up a step until he nearly bumped into the wall. She's at, Naruto's voice faded, his eyes darting back to the small entrance, and he shifted his feet. When he spoke again his voice was quieter, and his eyes studied Neji with a cautiousness that was unexpected. Let's just say she's safe. She's where no one can get to her. I'm sorry, it's not that I don't trust you, but if Hiashi ever found out we met, I'd rather you not give us up through some kind of force. Neji blinked, his dojutsu fading as his shoulders dropped a bit in surprise. It had not dawned on him that he shouldn't know, all he could focus on was the need to know she was taken care of, and it had overridden his usual caution. The fact that the reputably reckless Naruto had come to this conclusion first made the Junin think twice about pulling rank in order to demand answers. Seeing him relax, if even just a fraction, Naruto exhaled harshly in relief and lowered his hands. I didn't leave her alone either, she's being well taken care of. In fact, that's part of the reason why I'm back. I want to take some supplies to her and was hoping you could help? Without waiting for an answer Naruto continued on, rambling off a list of things that sounded like a safe house checklist that Neji struggled to memorize through the shock that swam in his brain. This was not the rash, loud, emotional idiot he had watched grow up. This Naruto was calm, calculated, passion still burned in his eyes, which had flickered back and forth from a dull brown to a bright blue with his excitement even though the rest of him remained as unrecognizable as before. A fear that had been subtly eating away at Neji's brain over the last few days was squashed as he realized that his cousin truly was in good hands. Thank you, Neji abruptly interjected, making Naruto pause mid-sentence, a startled expression spreading over his unremarkable face. For saving her, he clarified with a quick twitch of the lips that might be interpreted as a grateful smile. Hiashi-sama does not see Hinata-sama's strength, but it does not mean that she is weak. It took me a while to understand that her kind of strength is different, and just as valid as mine. More than anything, I am glad that she is still free. Naruto's eyes softened, one side of his mouth ticking up in a shy grin. I wish I could do more, that I could find a way to change the Hyuga entirely. But for now this is what I can do. And I promise, for as long as I live, no one will ever cage her. Neji's face hardened, his mouth pressing into a tense line. That will not be easy. The Hyuga will not allow her to simply be forgotten. Hiashi-sama has gone to Danzo to request his assistance. He has all but accused you both of mutiny, and by now the rest of the Hyuga Council is aware as well, I am sure. Lifting his eyes he drilled Naruto with a steely look from under furrowed brows. The information has not yet been leaked to the rest of the shinobi or the village at large, but at the moment you are wanted for kidnapping at the least, desertion at worst. Spinning around and swearing under his breath Naruto raked a hand through his limp brown hair, pacing anxiously as Neji watched with a deepening frown. It was a fine line the Jinchuriki was walking, between loyalty to his friends and patriotism to his village. How could he decide which to choose? Who would outrank the other? What about Kakashi-sensei? Naruto's head whipped around as the question popped out. One of the toads told me he was in the running for a possible stand in Hokage until Tsunade Baan woke up. Neji crossed his arms, eyes closing in contemplation. Honestly, I think it is a long shot. The Hyuga are backing Danzo, and right now we are the clan with the most resources, the one the advisors want on their side the most. Pity stirred in Neji's chest as Naruto pressed his fist to his mouth and chewed on his knuckle, staring blankly at the ground as his foot tapped rapidly in the dirt. The whole situation felt so ridiculously out of proportion for just shy Hinata and silly Naruto. But the reality was they were the heiress of the Hyuga and the Jinchuriki of the nine-tailed fox. Priceless pieces in a larger military game built upon the backs of countless pawns like Neji himself. The wild change in perspective left even Neji reeling if he dwelt on it too long. The ninja world was evolving faster than he could keep up with at times. Hinata-sama's fall from grace had sent nothing short of shockwaves through the Hyuga Council. For Naruto it must be absolutely dizzying. He couldn't imagine what it would be like to go from pariah to hero to felon in a matter of days. Just watching him gnaw on his lip as he paced made Neji's shoulders droop under the weight of an unexpectedly powerful empathy. "I will get you the items," he blurted out before his reservations could take over. His brain recoiled at the illogical gut reaction, but he fisted his hands at his sides and stood taller. Naruto's head snapped up, his gaze refocusing on Neji's face like he had forgotten he was still there. "You will?" Neji nodded solemnly, resolve condensing in his heart at this chance to snub fate by casting his lot in with the unpredictable shinobi. "Lend me one of your summons and I can give it a sealing scroll to take back with you to Mount Myoboku," he assured the slightly stunned man, a small smirk twisting the corners of his mouth at the widening of Naruto's eyes. "It wasn't that hard to deduce where you both are hiding. There are not many places that no one else can reach but you." The pout that crossed the unfamiliar face warmed Neji's heart. At least some of the old Naruto still resided in this unexpectedly mature anathema that stood before him. A hope unlike Neji had ever dared to acknowledge was gradually softening the hardened edges of his heart. Perhaps this was the beginning of the change that blonde brat had always screamed about? Perhaps this was his chance to repay his debt to Naruto for shattering his cold shell back at the Chunin exams? To show Hinata-sama a small portion of the kindness she had never wavered in bestowing upon him. "If you send me messengers I will update them with anything I discover," Neji promised. In the meantime, bending deeply at the waist, his hair swung over his shoulder as he bowed. "Please continue to keep Hinata-sama in your care. I leave her to you, Naruto." Naruto went completely still, frozen with his mouth hanging open and staring with eyes nearly bugging from his head at the weighty act of gratefulness from the normally aloof Hyuga. As Neji raised his head, Naruto's mouth clamped shut, a hand rubbing the back of his neck as a slight blush heated his face. "Hi, Neji, I won't let you down," a voice called from the other side of the rubble pile, summoning the workers to the midday meal that was served at each recovery site. Both shinobi turned towards the sound, understanding that their time was up. "Take care, Naruto," Neji said, pulsing chakra into his eyes and making sure that no one would see him exiting the area when he crawled out. As he looked through the walls of the building on the left, something caught his eye. With a surgically precise palm strike he smashed the pile of debris away, revealing a practically pristine, large cooking pot. Glancing over his shoulder, he nodded at Naruto, who was grinning at the revealed treasure. "I will have any other items I can find ready by the end of the afternoon." "Hi, arigato Neji." Within a few seconds the completely bland-looking man had disappeared, meandering away from the alley with a bored look on his face and leaving behind a small toad the perfect size to fit in Neji's ninja pouch. Slurping up the last of his soup, Kiba tipped his head back as far as he could, smacking the bottom of the bowl to make sure every last drop fell into his greedy mouth. Next to him Shino's glasses flashed, but he did not comment on his teammates' manners, just continued to politely scoop another spoonful into his own mouth. Licking his lips in satisfaction, Kiba ignored the silent judgment emanating from beside him on the makeshift bench made of salvaged crates. Maybe there's enough for seconds, Kiba wondered aloud, glancing over to the now much shorter line of people who were waiting for their midday meal before heading back to work. The pair of shinobi were in the heart of the village where the worst damage had been sustained. Hardly one brick remained standing upon another at this location. The only things that were worth salvaging were whatever remnants of the Akatsuki's destroyed warriors that could be found. Shinobi were collecting even the smallest bits of the puppet's machinery, any evidence left of the monstrous summons, and they were still searching for any scraps of the kunoichi's paper or Pain's black rods. At this point it seemed those particular items might have been made of nothing but pure chakra and therefore had completely disappeared. But orders were orders, and these were the things that the council had demanded be collected at any cost, no matter how small they were. All the best trackers had been brought here. The Inuzuka with their noses and ninkin. The Aburame with their beetles that could crawl into any space. Even the Hyuga who could see through the piles of rubble. Although for some reason Neji was assigned another area and Hinata was nowhere to be found outside of the Hyuga's compound, despite the strength of their Byakugan being practically unparalleled. Shino frowned at this thought, blowing on his soup when the steam fogged his glasses. He and Kiba had tried to see Hinata several times, only to be turned away and told she was not ready for visitors. It was a blatant lie. Hinata had never ignored her teammates. Besides, they had both seen her briefly after Naruto's return, upright and weak, but smiling all the same. The Hyuga in general were all acting strangely in his opinion, but with everything operating under strained circumstances, it was difficult to pinpoint a cause. The whole situation had Shino on edge, and he could tell Kiba felt the same. Were it not for the constant work orders that kept them occupied from dawn to dusk, the Inuzuka's anxious restlessness would have been much more obvious to the others. By Kiba's feet Akamaru devoured his own meal, fully engrossed in gnawing on the bone that Kiba had brought when suddenly the ninkin raised his head and growled. Shino froze mid-bite, knowing enough after being on a team with an Inuzuka for years that such a noise meant something was off. Kiba's sharp eyes were darting around, his hand slowly setting the empty bowl on the ground as his ears twitched. His eyes landed on one of the genin serving the soup, a plain-looking kid with flat brown hair and listless dark eyes. Shino followed his gaze, chewing slowly on a chunk of vegetable in an effort to appear casual. The mousy-looking server was nothing special. His beetles had not reacted at all when he had accepted the bowl of soup directly from that boy's hands. What was it about him that had Akamaru sniffing and growling lowly? As if sensing their scrutiny, the kid lifted his head and looked straight in their direction. A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, but he dutifully ducked his head once more and continued his job. As the last shinobi in line was served their bowl of soup, the genin grabbed the large empty pot and turned to carry it away, disappearing into the huddle of other volunteers who were also starting to clean up. Akamaru huffed sharply, and in a whisper so quiet Shino barely heard him, Kiba answered, "Show us, Akamaru." Calmly returning their bowls to the mess tent, the teammates walked away with forced slowness as they followed the ninkin's prowling tracks through the sorted piles of rubble, pretending to be headed for the next search quadrant. The hair on Akamaru's neck stood up and Kiba's nose was twitching as they meandered away from the area of the crater and through a labyrinth of back alleys. Shino carefully pushed his shades up his nose, the nervous habit concealing his own narrowed eyes. Around every corner they increased their speed but never caught a glimpse of the one they were following. Their prey's faint footprints in the dust were all that could be seen, not even a chakra trail could be sensed. When they reached the tree line at the edge of the village forest, Akamaru broke out into a full gallop, Kiba tearing off after him. Shino could barely keep up with the wild sprint as they crashed through the forest at breakneck speed. Deeper and deeper into the woods they chased a mere shadow as it flickered from tree to tree, dancing in and out of the afternoon shade like the beams of sunlight that dappled across the foliage. His hive was buzzing in reaction to his anxiety, telling him someone had suddenly appeared, someone familiar but different. Alarm was building in Shino's chest, but the further they went the more Akamaru was barking and a mischievous grin was spreading across Kiba's face, so he kept running and leaping after them, ignoring the burning in his legs as they climbed higher in elevation. His swiftest beetles were just ahead, but all they relayed were two words over and over. Fox, frog, fox, frog. Just when he thought his lungs might explode they all burst out into a brightly lit clearing atop the steepest hill Shino could remember being within the village walls. The chill of suspicion that had surrounded him burned away under the blazing daylight. Kiba was laughing in between gasps, out of breath but not fazed in the least as he slapped the equally panting and smiling genin from the soup kitchen on the back. Leaning forward to brace himself on a knee, Shino licked his wind-dried lips and pushed his glasses up his sweating face, catching his breath while trying to grasp the situation. There is only one person who has ever beaten Kiba in a race up this hill. Damn it, I guess Akamaru and I have some work to do. The last time we raced like that you lost by a mile. Kiba barked, his wheezing not hindering the volume of his teasing at all. As if dog breath. That's still my name carved on that tree. Or did you forget how to read? The genin pointed proudly over his head to the deeply slashed kanji in the bark that read Naruto, smiling in a way that was unmistakable no matter what color his hair and eyes had become, or how different his chakra felt. Shino's nostrils flared as he inhaled and exhaled, waiting for the two wild shinobi to stop their friendly bickering while his heart rate slowed back to normal. Akamaru was spinning around them in a circle, adding his own 2 cents in loud barks while smacking the genin's legs with his tail. But Shino wanted more than just a friendly competition to break up the monotonous chore of searching for needles in a haystack. He wanted answers. Why was Naruto disguised? Where had he been? Straightening up, he stepped closer and cleared his throat, making the others suddenly turn to him and struggle to put sober expressions on their faces. Lifting his hands from his sides to let the small swarm of beetles swirling in the air return to his sleeves, Shino mentally processed their information while appraising his former classmate. Naruto did not balk at the intense scrutiny, but neither did he let his henge slip. There was an edge to the unfamiliar gaze that caught Shino off guard. Even the gleam of friendliness in his brown eyes could not hide the sharp wariness emanating from him. It veiled his whole expression with a hardness that dampened his normally expressive features. Something has happened then, as I suspected. The old Naruto would never miss an opportunity for a celebration, nor would he hide simply to skip out on chores, no matter how menial they would seem. I assume you have important news about Hinata, Shino said tersely, getting straight to the point as he strode directly toward the short shinobi. Why? Because we have not seen her or you since after the invasion, and the Hyuga have come to my father and Kiba's mother asking about both of your whereabouts. Leaning in close enough so that he hoped the now sweating genin could practically feel his piercing glare through his shades, Shino lowered his voice threateningly. Because if anyone deserves to know what happened, it would be her teammates. Right? Naruto swallowed hard, taking a half step back only to bump into Akamaru, who was baring his teeth in a way that left one wondering if he was smiling or growling. He laughed nervously as the ninkin started to sniff him up and down. Good point, Shino, Kiba smirked, grabbing Naruto's shoulder with more force than was absolutely necessary, his nails digging in just enough to make a point without being flat-out painful. Akamaru lifted his head from his assessment and snarled with a sharp nod to his partner, and Kiba's eyes widened. Leaning in, he smelled Naruto's brown hair, his whole face twisting as Naruto pulled away, spluttering about creepy friends with no personal boundaries. Spill it, Kiba demanded, cutting off Naruto's complaints. And if you so much as breathe the words, I don't know, I'll bite you myself. Turning to Shino, he added with narrowed eyes. Her scent is all over him. He definitely knows something. Naruto sighed, grumbling something about nobody ever giving him the benefit of the doubt, and waved his hands in the air defensively. I'll tell you everything I can. I led you guys all the way out here just so we could talk, but you have to promise not to breathe a word of what I say, understand? The teammates shared a look, an entire conversation occurring in the long pause. Shino nodded slightly, and Kiba crossed his arms, shifting his slitted eyes to Naruto's tense face. We promise. Now, what happened? The story was short but neither simple nor sweet. Kiba and Akamaru paced restlessly as they listened, and Shino shoved his hands into his pockets. Throughout his retelling, Naruto's eyes hardened, his jaw clenching whenever he paused to find the right words. As he described Hiashi's attack, his hands fisted at this side. Several times he started to say something, then hesitated before carefully continuing, as though measuring each word before saying it aloud. Hearing Naruto explain the events that had taken place over the last few days left Shino's head spinning almost as much as when he had seen the devastation of his village in broad daylight. The implications of this new reality were massive. So you were being framed? Kiba gawked incredulously. Because you helped Hinata escape her asshole dad, the Hyuga are calling you a criminal, and the council is just going along with that bullshit? Naruto clicked his teeth as he nodded tersely. What does Hinata have to say? Shino asked. She had always been quiet like himself, but speaking fewer words did not mean one had less opinions. Does she want to remain hidden wherever it is that you have taken her, or come back and face her family? Naruto looked down and he chewed on the inside of his cheek before he answered. For now, she said she would wait for me to return with supplies. After her wound is healed and I can give her an accurate report on what is happening here, she can make her final choice. To stay with me or return. The way Naruto's voice dropped, the way his hand unconsciously brushed over his heart like it ached a bit, the way his eyes clouded as he stumbled over the last part of his statement, made Kiba and Shino both tilt their heads in curiosity. It took a few seconds for Naruto to shake off the sudden aura of gloom before he inhaled deeply and refocused on them, his cheeks blushing as he smiled shakily and raised his fist in determination. But no matter what, I'll make sure she's safe. I promise. When neither member of Team 8 responded to his declaration, Naruto's grin faded into a puzzled pout. Glancing back and forth between their stern glares, he raised an eyebrow. What, don't you believe me? He pressed his raised fist into his chest, stepping forward as his voice rose with urgency when he saw that they were just staring at him in deep contemplation. I'm not lying. Hinata is one of my most precious people. I would rather die than let. Kiba's finger jabbed sharply into Naruto's chest, making him yelp and rub at the spot in offense. If you break her heart, we'll kill you, Kiba threatened. All levity gone from his expression as he glared unblinking into Naruto's reddening face. The unfamiliar brown eyes widened as he took in Kiba's scowl, and he started to open his mouth only for Shino to cut him off. Why? Because she has loved you for longer than you probably deserve. And if you betray that, no one will find your body. The redness had spread all the way up to the tips of Naruto's ears, and his mouth clamped shut so hard his teeth clacked. His gaze drifted downward, and one could almost hear the gears spinning in his head as he processed all the parts of what they were insinuating. Slowly, the stiffness wilted from his posture, and he exhaled slowly as the shock faded from his features. I see. That long, huh? Looking back and forth between Kiba's smirk and Shino's flared nostrils, he chuckled softly and rubbed the back of his neck with a sheepish smile. I would expect nothing less from her teammates. I'll hold both of you to it, okay? A sharp woof made Naruto jump and look down. Yeah, you too, Akamaru. Raising his arm, Naruto thrust his fist out again, the most genuine grin they had seen yet lighting up his unwhiskered face. Kiba erupted into laughter as he punched it hard with his own knuckles, and Shino firmly tapped it as well. Even Akamaru jumped up, knocking his head into Naruto's hand. They talked quickly for a few more minutes, but Naruto was anxious to collect the last of his items and hurry back to Hinata before she started to worry. He handed them a sealing scroll, hoping that they would be able to add a few things to it for him to take. You guys know her better than anyone. If there's anything you can think to add, I'm sure she'll appreciate it. With a wave, Naruto sprinted back down the hill, leaving a frog behind as a messenger for the scroll. Shino watched him leap away, standing in silence well after he had disappeared. Did he find it surprising that Naruto was risking his reputation for the sake of his friends? No, in all honesty he did not. But did he believe they could hide forever? That depends. Shino sighed into the collar of his hoodie, hiding a frown. Beside him the toad croaked obliviously and the bug user shifted away uneasily from his natural enemy. Finally Kiba grunted loudly in exasperation, interrupting the strained staring between Amphibian and Aburame, and started to trudge down the opposite side of the steep hill. Where are you going? Shino asked. The village is the other way. And the secret garden that Hinata hides from the Hyuga is this way, Kiba called over his shoulder without turning around. If she's gonna be trapped with that idiot for who knows how long, she better at least have her medicinal herbs and whatever else she's got growing down there. She's bound to have a headache sooner or later. The toad hopped up on Akamaru's back with what sounded like a ribbit of agreement in Shino's opinion, and he hummed sympathetically as he followed them through the trees.
That's all for now. If you enjoyed this video, then please like, share and do comments.